Yeah, hi, how are you? How is it? How is life? Everything is okay?
Thank you for your support.
Yeah, thank you.
And more power to your NAM.
Yes. Ah, bueno.
Además, va a alentarlos a ustedes porque nos están tomando un lío, así que paso.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, may I ask you to get ready for our session? Good morning to all of you, Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I hereby declare open the 44th session of the Human Rights Council. And it is my honor to welcome the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mrs. Michelle Bachelet. I would also like to take this opportunity to extend a very warm welcome to all of you, delegations and other stakeholders present in this room and those who are following from somewhere virtually. Before we begin, let me also inform you that Mrs. Carrie Lam, the Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China, will address the Council via video message after the presentation of the annual report by the High Commissioner. We sent that round last night. Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, allow me to start by recalling some of the health-related measures to be implemented within the premises of the Palais des Nations. The same measures were actually applied already during the 43rd session and will be continued until further notice. So all persons present in the Palais are required to be free of COVID-19 symptoms and to maintain the recommended physical distancing of 2 meters at all times. To ensure physical distancing when entering and exiting the conference rooms, separate doors, as you can see, have been assigned as either entrance or exit doors. Within the conference rooms, participants will be asked to circulate clockwise, and there will be 2 seats unoccupied between all delegates. Moreover, everyone physically present inside the conference rooms is required to wear a face covering mask, and UNOC requests that participants please bring their own masks. I'm grateful for your understanding and respect for all these measures. Let us now turn to the modalities for the 44th session. As you will recall, we had an informal discussion on the 23rd of June in order to take stock of the extraordinary measures applied during the 43rd session. Subsequent to that informal, the Bureau considered all the views and concerns and ideas that had been expressed by members and observers of the Council during that discussion. And then the Bureau decided that the modalities for the 44th session should be updated based on that informal discussion and subsequently approved by the Council during the opening of the 44th session, which is where we are now. So a technical note providing all the details about the proposed modalities for this session was developed on the basis of the concept notes, which had been sent out on the 26th of May and the 4th of June, on the basis of a technical note for the resumed session, which we had circulated on the 12th of June, and on the basis of the lessons learned during that 43rd resumed session. This note was circulated to members and observers on the 25th of June. On the basis of this technical note and the minutes of the Bureau held yesterday, on the 29th of June, I wish to propose to the Council for its approval the extraordinary measures to be applied during the 44th session, most of which were already applied before during the 43rd. So the 44th session will take place from the 30th of June to the 17th of July. I'm very pleased to inform you that UNOC has agreed to service 2 lunchtime meetings on the last 2 days, the 16th and 17th of June. So these are the days when we'll take action on draft proposal. And as a result, we all very much hope that we'll be able to finish the Council on Friday, the 17th of June. Plenary meetings will take place in the Assembly Hall. Voting will take place in room 20. Room 12 will be available as an overflow room with webcast in English. During the voting process, the Assembly Hall or another conference room will serve as an overflow room with webcast. Access to all meeting rooms will be limited to 1 person per delegation, except for the voting, as I will explain in a few minutes. A certain number of seats will be reserved for representatives of NGOs, National Institutes for Human Rights, and international organizations, as well as the press. State delegations not wishing to enter the plenary room physically will be able to deliver their statements via pre-recorded video messages as provided under HRC Decision 19/119. Similarly, NGOs in consultative status with ECOSOC will be given the opportunity to do the same, that is to pre-record video messages as far as interactive dialogues, panels, and adoptions of UPR sessions are concerned. Representatives wishing to exercise their right of reply remotely would be able to do so by sending a request to the email address HRC list of speakers in one word @ohchr.org. They will receive an invitation to a video call 5 minutes prior to the moment when they will be able to exercise their rights of reply. Special procedure mandate holders, members of investigative mechanisms, and panelists unable to travel to Geneva will be able to participate in the interactive dialogues and panels via video messages and video calls, so this will be interactive. Those present in Geneva would address the Council in person if they so desire. The UPR outcomes of Spain and Kuwait will be considered at the 44th session based on the preference expressed by these states. The considerations of the adoptions of UPR outcomes for Kyrgyzstan, Guinea, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, Lesotho, Kenya, Armenia, Guinea-Bissau, Sweden, Grenada, Turkey, Kiribati, and Guyana will be moved to the 45th session of the Council because these countries expressed their preference for them to be postponed. For action on draft proposals, all 47 members of the Council may designate 2 representatives to be present in the room. A member of the Council not wishing to participate in person may opt for proxy voting by designating a representative of another state who will act on their behalf. Observer states introducing draft proposal as well as concerned countries may also designate 2 representatives to be present in the room at the time of action on relevant resolutions. All observer states and other observers may follow the proceedings in an overflow room. Rooms 18 and 20 will be made available for meetings of groups and for informal consultations. So let me remind all main sponsors, if you want to organize an informal virtually, please contact the Secretariat in order for these informals to be included in the bulletin of informal meetings and in our new online application SCED. Side events cannot take place at the Palais des Nations, as we said before. So in case any stakeholders decide to organize virtual events or physical events outside the Palais des Nations, these events will not be included in the bulletin of informal meetings as Council side events. Once again, let me underline that these proposed extraordinary modalities shall apply exclusively to the current circumstances and shall by no means serve as a precedent. Are there any delegations wishing to take the floor on any of these measures? I see none, so may I take it that the Council agrees to the proposed modalities and that they will be applied during the 44th session under the current circumstances? That seems to be the case. So thank you very much. We're now getting to agenda item 1, organizational and procedural matters. And I will now very briefly address other organizational and procedural matters. On the program of work for the 44th session, we have 3 very busy weeks ahead, as you have probably seen, with 7 panel discussions and 35 interactive dialogues, including with the High Commissioner on her annual report, as well as with 22 special procedure mandate holders, 2 commissions of inquiry, and 2 special representatives of the Secretary General. And as you will remember, we decided last December that there will be no longer any clustered interactive dialogues. Let me draw your attention to the fact that due to the exceptional circumstances, and in particular the time difference, to the locations from where some of the mandate holders will participate in the interactive dialogues, the debate under item 10 had to be exceptionally scheduled before the considerations of items 7 and 9. So all this can be explained by the time lag and the difficulty of organizing all these various interactive dialogues with people located all over the world. I would like to remind you that towards the end of the session, we shall proceed with the appointment of 4 special procedure mandate holders. I trust that the draft program of work may be approved with the understanding that it is an evolving document and that further adjustments may be required according to the progress of work. Are there any questions on that? So may I take it that the program of work for the 44th session of the Council is adopted? Thank you very much. On the list of speakers, ladies and gentlemen, the online system for inscription on the list of speakers for all interactive dialogues and panel discussions opened last Thursday, the 25th of June, and closes in 24 hours before the meeting in which the respective dialogue or discussion is scheduled to start. After the online inscription has closed, delegations may still withdraw by sending an email to the said address, hrc.listofspeakers@ohchr.org, whenever possible, rather please than by coming to the list of speakers desk for security reasons. As per standard practice, the list of speakers will close approximately 15 minutes after the beginning of each debate. The online system for inscription on the list of speakers for UPR outcomes will open on Monday, the 6th of July at 9 a.m. and will close on Thursday, the 9th of July at 6 p.m. As you know, no inscriptions will be possible after this deadline. Furthermore, I would like to remind that all delegations that due to the prohibition of distribution of printed materials, all oral statements should be electronically uploaded to interpreters at least 1 hour prior to the estimated time of their delivery. It is crucial, it helps interpreters prepare, and it increases the quality of the interpretation, so it's in your interest to upload these speeches on time, so please do so. This applies to statements made in person as well as to video statements. I was informed by UNOC that during the 43rd session this actually didn't work very well, so please let us make an effort to do better. I would also like to take this opportunity to strongly encourage all of you to respect speaking time limits for all debates and to exercise self-restraint in the preparation of your statements. Along with the Vice Presidents, we shall strive to ensure that meetings begin on time and that speaking time limits be strictly observed by everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to remind you that the deadline for the submission of draft proposals to be adopted during the 44th session has been set for Thursday, the 9th of July at 1 p.m. An extension of the deadline for the submission of draft proposals will be granted only once for each proposal under exceptional circumstances and for a maximum of 24 hours. In the interest of ensuring the effective participation of all stakeholders in the work of the Human Rights Council, I encourage main sponsors of draft proposals to share draft texts also with civil society organizations and other observers that follow the negotiations in the Council. With regard to the accessibility of our work, I would like to remind you that there is a focal point for accessibility within the Secretariat, who can be contacted if necessary, and I would like to encourage delegations to consider requesting the accessibility of mandated panel discussions to ensure live captioning and sign language interpretation. In addition, delegations are requested to upload their oral statements in Word so that they can be accessible to persons with disabilities. Please note the speeches uploaded in non-accessible format will not be posted on the extranet. I also wish to emphasize that the United Nations, including the Council, has a zero tolerance to any form of harassment, including sexual harassment, and that in this context, the Director General has pledged to implement the Code of Conduct meant to prevent harassment, including sexual harassment, at UN events here in Geneva, and that I have appointed a gender focal point to assist with the implementation in the Council. Any and all complaints will be dealt with promptly. We encourage reporting of any incident directly to UNOC security officers. Furthermore, I cannot stress enough that maintaining a safe space for the active participation of representatives of civil society and national human rights institutions is not only part of the mandate of the Council, but is also our common interest. As President of the Council, I assure you that I will follow up on all allegations that I receive concerning acts of reprisal and intimidation that are carried out in connection to the Human Rights Council, its mechanisms and procedures. I call on everybody to take all necessary measures to prevent and ensure adequate protection against such acts. I thank you for your cooperation and for ensuring that this Council is a safe environment for all. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, it is now my pleasure to open Agenda Item 2, entitled Annual Report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and Reports of the Office of the High Commissioner and the Secretary General. This agenda item will remain open throughout the session. It is a great pleasure and honor to invite the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mrs. Michelle Bachelet, to present her annual report and to give us an oral update on the human rights impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in accordance with the President's statement on this subject, PRST, /43/1. Let me remind you that the interactive dialogue on the annual report is scheduled to begin this afternoon, and having spoken for a very long time now, it is my pleasure to hand over the floor to the High Commissioner.
Distinguished President of the Council, Excellencies, colleagues and friends, I'm honored to discuss with the Council the report on the work of my office in 2019, including our more than 80 field presences, that is Report A/HRC/43/3, the report that I presented at the beginning of the 43rd session of the Council in February, outlines efforts to assist states to uphold all human rights at a time of increasing challenges. Because I presented it already at that time, I'm not going to present it again. Those challenges are rising sharply today. I am glad to have this opportunity to update the Human Rights Council on our human rights concerns related to COVID-19, which continues to gather pace, including many countries with limited medical, social and economic capacity to cope with its consequences. 6 months after the first cases were detected, it is clear that this epidemic threatens both peace and development, and that it calls for more civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights, not less. The pandemic should spur us to adopt strong transformative measures to heighten the powerful protections that human rights-based policies can provide by promoting public health, public confidence in official guidance, and greater social and economic resilience. It urgently calls for leadership grounded in clarity, evidence, and principle to protect the most vulnerable members of society and to address the profound inequalities that are accelerating the pandemic's incidence and impact. Wherever they exist, disaggregated data indicate that members of racial and ethnic minorities and indigenous people are both more likely to die of COVID-19 and are hit the hardest by its socioeconomic consequences. This is particularly true of people of African descent, who across every area of the Afro-descendant diaspora continue to face unequal education, inadequate services and access to healthcare, and intersecting forms of structural discrimination that put them on the front lines in so-called essential jobs that deepen their vulnerability. Indigenous people are also particularly vulnerable. Inadequate access to healthcare and other key facilities exacerbates the risk from the pandemic, while the absence of disaggregated data hinders the adoption of tailored measures to address their needs. It is time for this neglect to end. I note that pandemic response plans in Australia and Costa Rica laid out specific efforts to protect the health of indigenous people, while Panama is implementing a long-term project to improve basic services and infrastructure, including healthcare in its 12 indigenous territories. The Russian Federation has reported that it is using remote technologies to improve medical services for indigenous nomadic groups in the context of the pandemic. COVID-19 aggravates the exclusion and discrimination suffered by women and girls. Their lack of social protection, stemming from their concentration in informal, low-status and low-paid jobs, their burden of care for children and the elderly, and the continued exclusion of women from decision-making. Pervasive gender-based violence has also grown in the last few months, with an increased number of users of 24/7 hotlines for domestic violence. This situation risks rolling back hard-fought gains for women's health, economic participation, and equal rights. Older people are suffering the highest death tolls and worst medical harms. The shocking rates of contagion and death in residential care homes suggest profound shortcomings in the approach taken by some national authorities to the pandemic impact on the care home sector, as well as the quality of medical surveillance and services they provide. I joined the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights in calling for social care reforms that prioritize individualized support to older people and promote their full inclusion in their communities. The provision of vital services for people with disabilities should also be significantly strengthened. Places of detention require upgraded health care, and non-custodial alternatives should be expanded. I welcome action taken by numerous governments to enable the release of tens of thousands of prisoners in line with our calls to address contagion and overcrowding. I urge a stronger focus on releasing women and children who are deprived of their liberty in light of the low numbers released globally, as well as action to uphold foreign detainees' rights to consular assistance. The pandemic is also likely to generate profound and long-lasting impacts on children. UNICEF has reported that unless there is urgent action to protect families from the economic impacts of the pandemic, the number of children living below national poverty lines could increase by 15% in 2020, reaching 672 million. The World Food Programme estimates that the number of young children suffering acute malnutrition could increase by 10 million this year. Disruption to schools and training programs heightens the risk of the poorest children falling behind and increases children's exposure to the threat of domestic violence, child labor, child marriage, and female genital mutilation. We're also seeing signs of a surge in online sexual exploitation of children. The closure of training programs, higher education, and jobs also creates heavy burdens on young people under the age of 25. Globally, over 75% of young people work in informal jobs, often in very hard-hit sectors, such as restaurants and entertainment services. This will have a profound impact on many countries, as well as on migration trends. Young people under the age of 30 account for around 70% of international migrant flows. Already the pandemic's interlocking health, socioeconomic, and protection impacts are deepening the suffering of migrants. In particular, many migrants are detained and overcrowded and in unsanitary centers such as in Greece, Honduras, Malaysia, and Panama, where they are at risk of infection, as well as forced return to fragile health systems. I'm dismayed by reports indicating that in many countries, members of minority communities and migrants face increasing stigmatization, including in some cases by officials. In Sri Lanka and India, members of the Muslim minority have been targeted by stigma and hate speech associating them with COVID-19. In Bulgaria, Roma people have been stigmatized as a public health threat, with some local authorities setting up checkpoints around Roma settlements to enforce lockdowns. In Pakistan, hate speech against religious minorities remains virulent. Stigmatization and threats against people presumed to be infected by COVID-19 have also been reported in Haiti, Iraq, and many other countries. In its urgent debate 2 weeks ago, this Council rightly highlighted the importance of principled and non-discriminatory policing in upholding human rights. I welcome the opportunity to intensify our work relating to justice for people of African descent and other discriminated communities at a time when people across the globe are demanding change, not just with regard to police violence. Too often, unjust and violent actions by law enforcement personnel reflects systemic racial discrimination that is deeply embedded in the institutions across society, as recent events, including COVID-19, have shown, it is time for urgent and deep change in many states. Discrimination kills. Depriving people of their social and economic rights kills. And this death and harms damage all of society. COVID-19 is like a heat-seeking device that exposes and is fueled by systemic failures to uphold human rights. Without rapid and decisive national and international action, the pandemic will put an end to hopes to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Particularly in the world's poorest countries, the high toll of death and medical harms, massive loss of jobs, especially in the informal economy, disruption to education, rising food prices, and deepening poverty are likely to drive tens of millions of people into extreme poverty and doing a decade or more of development gains. The Secretary General has warned of an imminent global food crisis with long-term repercussions for hundreds of millions of children and adults. I urge all world leaders to grasp the vital importance of this moment and to take immediate action to support the work of multilateral institutions that are struggling to assist countries and people in this crisis. Across the world, COVID-19 is also being instrumentalized to limit people's rights to speak, to express opinion, and to participate in making decisions that affect their lives. In the Russian Federation, China, Kosovo, Nicaragua, and many other countries, I note reports of threats and intimidation against journalists, bloggers, and civic activists, particularly at the local level, with the apparent aim of discouraging criticism of the authorities' responses to COVID-19. In each, I'm concerned by restrictions on freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, including with respect to online discussion of the spread of COVID-19, as well crackdowns on civil society with asset freezes, intimidation and arrest targeting human rights defenders, journalists, political activists, and their family members. El Salvador's pandemic response had led to numerous reports of excessive and arbitrary enforcement of measures, as well as announcements that undermine the authority and independence of the country's institutions, disregarding rulings made by the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court and legislation adopted by the Legislative Assembly. Censorship and criminalization of speech are likely to suppress crucial information needed to address the pandemic. I only respect for their rights, including the right to participate in transparent and accountable decision-making, will inspire people to trust the policies adopted by the governments. Harmful disinformation should be countered by efforts to provide credible, accurate information from authoritative sources and promote social media literacy. Journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society activists can assist the authorities to identify and resolve shortcomings in their COVID-19 responses, and crackdowns are not only unjust violations of their rights, they damage the effectiveness of policies to prevent and mitigate the impact of the pandemic. Madam President, it is vital that leaders maintain consistent, credible, and fact-based communication with the people they serve. I'm encouraged by the Republic of Korea's open and communicative approach to leaving no one behind in its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The government acknowledged early on the need for comprehensive policies that reach the most vulnerable in Korean society, including older people, the homeless, the LGBTI community, and undocumented migrants. I commend the authorities for exempting medical institutions from reporting the undocumented migration status of their patients and for recently enabling anonymous testing after issues which resulted in increased stigmatization of LGBTI people. I encourage consideration and swift adoption of a comprehensive anti-discrimination law building on the lessons learned from its response to the pandemic. In contrast, in Belarus, Brazil, Burundi, Nicaragua, Tanzania, and the United States, among others, I'm concerned that statements that deny the reality of viral contagion and increasing polarization on key issues may intensify the severity of the pandemic by undermining efforts to curb its spread and strengthen healthcare systems. Madam President, COVID-19 is deepening local and regional threats to peace. People in states where health and essential services have already been devastated by conflict and crisis are acutely vulnerable to the pandemic's multidimensional harms. I reiterate my call for the easing or suspension of sectorial sanctions in order to ensure that medical care and aid is accessible to all, and I reaffirm my strong support for the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire to enable effective pandemic action. In Yemen, armed clashes continue across the country, despite initial encouraging responses to the Secretary General's call for a ceasefire. The current rapid spread of COVID-19, as well as cholera, malaria, and dengue fever, make it imperative to allow unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid. The very high rates of severe complication and death from COVID-19 reflect the widespread destruction of Yemen's health and sanitation infrastructure and the poverty and vulnerability of civilians generated by 5 years of conflict. Many health workers in the country have no protective equipment, according to reports, and most are receiving no salaries. My office has also verified cases of intimidation and arrest of people suspected of having COVID-19 and health workers who discussed the epidemic in the north. Access to humanitarian assistance is also of critical importance in Syria, where healthcare centers repeatedly bombed during almost a decade of war could be swiftly overwhelmed. OSHA estimates that 80% of people in Syria live below the poverty line, and the World Food Programme has already documented rising food insecurity. Continued and increased cross-border access is essential, and I urge extension of the authorization of cross-border aid by the Security Council, as well as the reopening of the Al Arabiya border. I'm also concerned that the current grave human rights situation in the Sahel region may further deteriorate as the impact of COVID-19 increases people's suffering, poverty, and grievances. Already armed extremist groups are strengthening their influence over local communities in central and northern Mali, northern Burkina Faso, and parts of the Lake Chad Basin. Several communities in Burkina Faso and central Mali have created armed community-based groups, in some cases with the support of state authorities, with growing reports of their involvements in killings, abductions, forced conscription of children and adults, and extortion. Increasing human rights violations by the armed forces have also been documented in several countries, and displacement is rising sharply across the region, heightening people's vulnerability to contagion to COVID-19. I urge all G5 states to step up efforts to ensure accountability for allegations of human rights violation by security forces and to strengthen as much as possible the presence of civilian authorities and the provision of services. The Office will continue to strengthen our field presences and our work with the compliance framework of the G5 Sahel Joint Force. In South Sudan, COVID-19 could further heighten the extreme vulnerability of its population. Many, if not most, South Sudanese do not benefit from adequate healthcare systems, as a recent report by my office confirmed. In addition, the slow pace of implementation of the revitalized peace agreement, including the appointment of governments and failure to address root causes, put the country at significant risk of renewed generalized violence. Community-based militias and self-defense groups are being armed with military-grade weapons and used as proxy fighters by all parties, and these localized and intercommunal attacks are already causing very high numbers of casualties. Haiti, where almost 60% of the population lives under the poverty line, is a clear example of countries where, after years of crisis, the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 is likely to be devastating, further fueling social grievances, criminality, and unrest. Zimbabwe is yet another country where COVID-19 exacerbating severe challenges. Last month, 3 women from the main opposition party were reportedly abducted and tortured in the context of enforcement of COVID restrictions and were later charged with false allegations and incarcerated. However, recent decisions by the country's courts could indicate a pathway towards greater justice and a more sound foundation of governance. This includes rulings that the government must make provisions for access to water as a right and must provide protective equipment to frontline workers, that people with disabilities have a right to information about the pandemic in accessible formats, and that law enforcement must respect human rights and the work of journalists while enforcing lockdown measures. Action in this direction could help build a new and transformative path for many countries. Excellencies, the pandemic is not over again. Yesterday, Dr. Tedros said the worst is just to come. So we need to continue working together to defeat the pandemic and its health and socioeconomic consequences, to ensure that the suffering of people is ended as swiftly as possible, and to enable effective recovery. Policies must address the inequalities and protection gaps that have made society so vulnerable. They must look ahead, strengthening human rights protections to prevent such crises in the future. The Secretary-General's call to action for human rights is a strong and principled framework for coordinated action to realize a rights-based recovery, including the human rights to a healthy environment. The European Commission's proposal for a multi-year response to the pandemic that tackles action for renewable energy together with public health and socio-economic support, committing to leave no one behind, is an example of sound leadership. I know that in some countries the recession sparked by the pandemics is already leading to calls by industries for regulations to be relaxed, including in sectors where human rights abuses are often reported. Such calls should be resisted. We need to build a new economy that is environmentally sustainable, equitable, fair, and inclusive. I encourage all states to ensure that economic aid and stimulus packages for businesses stipulate that beneficiary companies should follow the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. This conditionality has already been included in business aid measures adopted by Denmark. The pandemic and its impact must be addressed with coordinated and global work, including for a vaccine, which must be viewed as a global public good. A person's wealth, gender, or migration status should not determine accessibility to a vaccine that may save individual lives, but also the future of economies and societies. Any lack of international cooperation and any efforts that prioritizes private profit or political gain over public health will extend repeated cycles of infection and hinder economic recovery. Swift and effective measures have been taken by many developing countries, including Africa, drawing from the region's expertise in contact tracing and community-based public health. But the epidemic is spreading, and to hold it back, many countries will require sustained international support, including debt relief and direct financial investment to shore up health systems and ensure fulfillment of the right to development. To facilitate effective responses that address the human rights impacts of COVID-19, my office has issued detailed guidance regarding emergency measures, the civic space, detention, indigenous people, migrants, minorities, women, racial discrimination, LGBTI people, older people, and people with disabilities. We have also developed a framework of 10 human rights indicators, building on the data frameworks of the SDGs and the Global Humanitarian Response Plan, to enable clarity in identifying especially hard-hit and vulnerable groups and assist the implementation of effective policies to avert these harms. These key indicators have been appended to the framework document that guides all UN socio-economic responses to COVID-19. To further advance this vital work and ensure that human rights are at the heart of the response to the pandemic, we need support. Global socio-economic forecasts predict at least 2 years of dramatic decreases in human development indicators across the world. We have accompanied and shared your determined efforts to maintain the health, safety, and well-being of your peoples at huge cost on every level. But without close and targeted attention to social cohesion, to inclusion, and to fairness, these efforts cannot offset the deprivation that has swept up entire communities. We must all acknowledge that human rights are critical to the recovery. At this crucial time, we also need to be able to count on steady, predictable resources and firm political will in the months and years ahead. The risks are already enormous. A strengthened partnership can mitigate them. Your engagement can and will make the difference now and in the days to come. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. So as announced earlier, we will now watch a video by Mrs. Carrie Lam, Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China.
Madam President, as Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China, I welcome this opportunity to state our position on the enactment of national security legislation for the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. National security is invariably under the purview of the central authorities, be it in China or any other countries. In all countries, the power to legislate on national security rests solely with the central government. Hong Kong is an inalienable part of China, a special administrative region enjoying a high degree of autonomy, which comes directly under the central government. As an exceptional arrangement under the policy of one country, two systems, the basic law governing the two special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau obliges the SAR to enact local legislation on its own to safeguard national security. Macau has successfully completed this task in 2009. Hong Kong, after a failed attempt in 2003, has not been able to fulfill its constitutional duty. For the sake of not only the 7.5 million Hong Kong residents, but also the 1.4 billion people in the Chinese mainland, the question of how long we could tolerate such a gaping hole in national security has to be asked and answered. Legislation to safeguard national security is now urgently needed. Since last June, Hong Kong has been traumatized by escalating violence fanned by external forces. The threats of terrorist acts posed by illegal possession of explosives and firearms, and the horrible manners faced by innocent Hong Kong people were recapped by my senior police colleague Oscar Kwok and a prominent businesswoman Pansy Ho, respectively, when they spoke at this forum in March this year and September last year. Once rated as one of safest cities in the world, security and stability have become relevant concerns. During this period, groups advocating Hong Kong independence and self-determination incited protesters, very often radicalized young people, to desecrate and burn the national flag, vandalize the national emblem, and storm the central government's office in Hong Kong. Further, some local politicians proclaimed that they would paralyze the Hong Kong SAR government, while others campaigned for foreign governments to interfere in Hong Kong's affairs, or even to impose sanctions on Hong Kong. No central government could turn a blind eye to such threats to sovereignty and national security, as well as risks of subversion of state power. All in all, these acts have crossed the one-country red line and called for resolute action. As the highest organ of state power in China, the National People's Congress has the constitutional power and the duty to enact national security legislation for the Hong Kong SAR. The national law to be enacted has taken into account Hong Kong's actual situation and will be applied in Hong Kong by way of promulgation in accordance with the Basic Law. The legislation aims to prevent, curb, and punish acts of secession, subversion of state power, terrorist activities, and collusion with foreign or external forces to endanger national security. These crimes will be clearly defined in the law. It will only target an extremely small minority of people who have breached the law, while the life and property, basic rights and freedoms of the overwhelming majority of Hong Kong residents will be protected. The legislation upholds important legal principles such as presumption of innocence and protection of the rights of the suspect. It will have no retrospective effect. Except in rare specified situations, the Hong Kong SAR shall exercise jurisdiction over offences under the law. Investigation, prosecution, and adjudication will be undertaken by the Hong Kong Police and the Department of Justice of the Hong Kong SAR government and the independent judiciary, including that of final adjudication. The law will not affect Hong Kong's renowned judicial independence. It will not affect legitimate rights and freedoms of individuals, which are protected under the Basic Law and relevant international covenants applied to Hong Kong. They include, among others, the freedom of speech, of the press, of assembly, of demonstration, and of procession. In short, the legislation will not undermine one country, two systems and Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy. Hong Kong is a free and diversified society. We respect differences in opinion and strive on reaching consensus. But the one country principle is non-negotiable and could not be compromised, as without one country, two systems will stand on shaky ground and Hong Kong's stability and prosperity will be at risk. For those foreign governments or politicians raising objections to the legislation, one could only lament the double standards they are adopting. All those countries which have pointed their fingers at China have their own national security legislation in place. We could think of no valid reason why China alone should be inhibited from enacting national security legislation to protect every corner of its territory and all of its nationals. Madam President, when I took office 3 years ago, I pledged to implement the one country, two systems policy, uphold the Basic Law, defend the rule of law, and promote a deep and positive relationship between the central government and the Hong Kong SAR. Despite the escalating tensions in society in recent years, I remain hopeful that with full conviction in one country, two systems, and upon implementation of the national security legislation, Hong Kong will ride out the political storm since last June and emerge stronger with stability restored. I and the Hong Kong SAR government are determined to capitalize on our strengths, harness the opportunities presented by a country's development, and provide Hong Kong people with brighter prospects. I urge the international community to respect our country's right to safeguard national security and Hong Kong people's aspirations for stability and harmony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now have a very short technical break and then start the enhanced interactive dialogue on the Philippines. Thank you. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to take your seats again and we'll pursue. We have a small technical problem in that we can't show the list of speakers yet on the screen, but I will announce 2 or 3 speakers ahead each time, and I hope that technicians will be able to sort it out very quickly. So as already announced, we start with the enhanced interactive dialogue on the situation of human rights in the Philippines, pursuant to Council Resolution 41/2, and it is my honor to welcome our distinguished presenters. Madame Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights, His Excellency Mr. Menardo Guevara, Justice Secretary and Minister of the Republic of the Philippines, Mrs. Karen Lucia Gomez Dumpuy, Representative of the Commission on Human Rights of the Republic of the Philippines, and Mr. Ray Paolo Santiago, Executive Director of the Ateneo Human Rights Center at Ateneo de Manila University. High Commissioner, you have the floor. The list of speakers will close within 15 minutes.
Madam President, Excellencies, as requested by Resolution 41/2, I turn now to our report on the human rights situation in the Philippines. Let me begin by thanking the government for its cooperation, including written submissions and several meetings with my office in Bangkok and Geneva. Much of the material in the report is drawn from these official sources. We also received hundreds of submissions from organizations and individuals across the Philippines. However, my team was not granted access to the country in relation to the mandate. The findings of the report are very serious. Laws and policies to counter national security threats and illegal drugs have been crafted and implemented in ways that severely impact human rights. They have resulted in thousands of killings, arbitrary detentions, and the vilification of those who challenge the severe human rights violation. The report finds that more than 248 human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, and trade unionists were killed between 2015 and 2019. This includes a large number of environmental and indigenous people rights defenders. Human rights defenders are routinely smeared as terrorists, enemies of the state, and even viruses akin to COVID-19. The recent passage of the new Anti-Terrorist Act heightens our concerns about the blurring of important distinctions between criticism, criminality, and terrorism. The law could have a further chilling effect on human rights and humanitarian work, hindering support to vulnerable and marginalized communities. So I would urge the President to refrain from signing the law and to initiate a broad-based consultation process to draft legislation that can effectively prevent and counter violent extremism, but which contains some safeguards to prevent its misuse against people engaged in peaceful criticism and advocacy. And of course, my office is ready to assist in such a review. The report also finds that serious human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, have resulted from key policies driving the so-called war on drugs and incitement to violence from the highest levels of government. The campaign against illegal drugs is being carried out without due regard for the rule of law, due process, and the human rights of people who may be using or selling drugs. The report finds that the killings have been widespread and systematic, and they are ongoing. We also found near total impunity, indicating an unwillingness by the state to hold to account perpetrators of extrajudicial killings. Families of the victims, understandably, feel powerless, with the odds firmly stacked against justice. Moreover, by senior government officials' own admission, the draconian campaign has been ineffective in reducing the supply of illicit drugs. While the Philippines have made some progress in the advancement of economic and social rights, indigenous peoples and farmers continue to be caught in a tug-of-war between powerful businesses and political interests, the army, and non-state armed groups like the New People's Army, who are also responsible for abuses. Despite progressive legislation, the rights of indigenous people, the right to education, and to other basic economic and social rights remain elusive for many remote communities. Excellencies, the Philippines has been actively engaged with many UN human rights mechanisms over the years, and this report has built upon many of their recommendations. A senior human rights advisor has also been supporting the UN country team since 2014. Our office is ready to strengthen our constructive engagement on the basis of the report's recommendations. We have identified several areas for further cooperation with the government, including a strengthening domestic accountability mechanism, improving data gathering on alleged police violation, review of legislation and policies on drug control and terrorism, and help to bridge gaps between civil society and state authorities. I urge the Council to remain active and vigilant on the situation in the Philippines by mandating my office to continue monitoring and reporting, as well as through support for technical cooperation to implement the report's recommendations. The state has an obligation to conduct independent investigations into the grave violation we have documented. In the absence of clear and measurable outcomes from domestic mechanisms, the Council should consider options for international accountability measures. I hope the report will mark the beginning of the end of impunity for serious human rights violations in the Philippines. The families of victims and the country's courageous human rights defenders count on the international community for help to address these ongoing and serious human rights issues and for the Council to rise up to its prevention mandate. It is not enough to argue that the government's heavy-handed policies remain popular in the country, because victims tend to be from lower socioeconomic classes and relatively disempowered communities. There is an even stronger imperative to ensure their protection. We must not let them down. Political leadership is about respecting, promoting, and protecting the rights of everyone in society, in particular the most vulnerable, so as to leave no one behind. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. And we will now watch a video message, starting with His Excellency Mr. Menardo Guevara.
Madam High Commissioner, Excellencies, good morning from Manila. Transparency and constructive cooperation characterize the Philippine engagement with the UN and the international community. This is no less true in the area of human rights. Human rights is a fundamental national interest, rooted in our recent history as the first country to use people power successfully to restore democracy by toppling a dictatorship notorious for human rights violations. Human rights anchor the agenda of the administration, which seeks to promote and uplift the dignity of all 110 million Filipinos. First and foremost of these rights is the safety, security, and well-being of the general public. This commitment has been firm and unwavering, more so now as the nation faces the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. An assessment of the human rights situation in the Philippines can only be credible when it is properly informed by context on the ground. Like many governments, we face problems that heavily bear upon efforts to improve the lives of our people and secure their future. These include drugs, corruption, criminality, and terrorism. We cherish our newly won, hard-fought democracy, so we are deeply concerned about the inroads made by the drug trade in the subversion of democracies. Our democracy and legal institutions ensure that the national response to these problems, even the gravest of them aimed at democracy, are always within the law and in full respect of human rights. Excellencies, our President ran and won on a campaign promise of a drug-free Philippines, where our people are safe and their rights protected. The President has discharged this mandate faithfully. After 4 years, the President and his anti-drug campaign enjoy the strong and widespread support of our people. As a democracy, we must continue on a path that has the public's unflagging support. A monitoring mechanism called Real Numbers PH ensures public transparency and full accountability in this campaign. It accounts for and publishes evidence-based outcomes of the campaign across 42,046 villages across the country, as well as figures on law enforcement actions and drug-related cases in the courts. Our government has also conducted briefings and dialogues with the representatives of the diplomatic community in the Philippines on human rights issues of concern to them, the aim being to provide more transparency and better appreciation of such issues. Further briefings are planned. We have also established an interagency panel chaired by my office that is conducting a judicious review of the 5,655 anti-illegal drug operations where deaths occurred. The Philippine National Police is obliged by its internal mechanisms to conduct motu proprio investigations, whether or not there are complainants, on all law enforcement operations that result in deaths and take action on this basis. This review panel, external to the Philippine National Police, reevaluates these cases and examines the propriety of reinvestigating them or filing appropriate charges against erring law enforcement officers. The panel intends to engage affected families, provide them with legal options and assistance in criminal prosecution of law enforcers who have overstepped legal bounds in their operations. It will present a report on its work by the end of November of this year. This review mechanism will not only reinforce accountability on the drug campaign, it will tighten the web of existing mechanisms to prevent cases of impunity, including the Interagency Committee on Extralegal Killings and Forced Disappearances, Torture, and other grave violations to life, liberty, and security of persons. I chair this mechanism and have worked closely with the CHR and the university-based think tank to improve its institutional capabilities. And as with all human rights-related mechanisms in the country, the Commission on Human Rights will be involved in its capacity as an independent monitoring body. The continued unhampered functioning of the Philippine CHR underpins our strong position against calls for an independent investigative mechanism, including the one made before the International Criminal Court, from which we have withdrawn. Excellencies, claims that there is impunity or near impunity in the country find no anchor in a system that provides every avenue to examine, establish, and pursue a claim of wrongdoing by a state actor, if such claim is substantiated with facts. We take each case brought before our authorities with the diligence it deserves. In the same manner, we ask that the human rights mechanisms exercise due diligence in validating allegations brought before them by parties. The independence of our courts is affirmed by convictions of an Army general in 2018 and of members of a high-profile political family and police officials in 2019, and the indictment of a former police chief in January this year. Excellencies, the government has been sincere in fully engaging all stakeholders, the international community and the UN, including the OHCHR, on human rights issues. We intend to broaden positive engagement with the UN system, including through an expanded cooperation framework and stronger platform of partnerships, which we are discussing with the UN Resident Coordinator in the Philippines. We are pursuing these directions in line with the government's determination to protect the public, shield democracy, and promote the human rights of every Filipino. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Mrs. Karen Lucia Gomez-Dumpit.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Human Rights Council and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as the world endures the impact of the pandemic, it is our privilege and duty to speak before you today. The Commission on Human Rights welcomes the report on the human rights situation in the Philippines. We consider government's engagement with the OHCHR as a sign of greater cooperation with independent mechanisms, and we acknowledge its response, but regret the public rejection of the conclusions and recommendations. We share the view that while the climate of impunity can be traced from the failure to fully address past human rights violations, present attitudes and behavior towards human rights have been conditioned by harmful rhetoric of inciting hatred, vilifying legitimate dissent, and incentivizing violence, allowing impunity to acutely persist today. There is a continuing obligation for the state to end impunity, pursue social justice, and uphold the dignity and human rights of all. Part of this obligation is to accept the report's findings and recommendations, continue to dialogue, take definitive steps to demonstrate the effectiveness of domestic mechanisms, and cooperate with other independent accountability mechanisms, including the special procedures. The over-reliance on a strong-arm approach has largely contributed to the pervading culture of impunity. To improve the human rights situation, the Philippines must change course, guided by the human rights-based approach to democratic governance. Government must translate these recommendations into concrete actions and establish a timeline to deliver results in the short and medium term. The CHR therefore recommends the following. Immediately halt the harmful rhetoric from the highest levels of authority. Communicate clear messages to frontliners who deliver the promotion and protection of human rights on the ground. Adopt a language in policy and practice respectful of democratic institutions and processes, including the media, for its role to inform and stimulate public debate. Allow full cooperation of the Philippine National Police, the Internal Affairs Service, and other government agencies with the CHR to enable investigations into human rights violations, including the killings that have plagued the anti-drug campaign. Enable accountability mechanisms to fulfill the rights to truth, access to justice, and effective remedies for all victims. Account and locate each and every killing and other human rights violations in the justice system. Provide effective protection for victims, whistleblowers, and witnesses, and prosecute all perpetrators. Provide direct and adequate assistance to all victims of the anti-drug campaign and families left behind. Accelerate the decongestion program to alleviate the condition of persons deprived of liberty. Guarantee transparency and report to CHR all incidents of deaths in custody. Revise the current legislative agenda to remove the reintroduction of the death penalty and the proposal to lower the minimum age of criminal responsibility. Establish the National Preventive Mechanism as the Commission is ready to accept the designation with civil society representatives and reconsider the enactment of the anti-terror bill to include stronger human rights safeguards. We ask the Human Rights Council and the international community to support the technical cooperation between the government and OHCHR. For OHCHR to have the mandate to continue to monitor and report progress on the recommendations, and in the absence of timely and measurable outcomes, to consider options for other international accountability measures. The Commission stands together with the victims, disadvantaged groups, and human rights defenders in valuing the Council as a fulcrum of international discourse and cooperation for the protection of all human rights. This has encouraged us to defend our shrinking civic space and respond to human rights attacks on the ground. Your sustained focus will continue to provide protection for human rights defenders, amplify the voices of the victims as it presents government with the opportunity to take proactive strides in responding to human rights concerns in the country. To forge constructive dialogue and collaboration at home, we respectfully ask the Human Rights Council for this opportunity to remain open. Mabuhay at maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much. And the next video comes from Mr. Rey Paolo Santiago.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good morning to everyone. I am Rey Paolo Santiago, Executive Director of the Human Rights Center of Ateneo de Manila University, which has constructively engaged law and policy makers. We employ an evidence-based approach in the various initiatives we undertake. Thank you, Excellencies, for this opportunity to share. I will no longer highlight the positive points in the Philippine government's human rights situation submitted to this council. Suffice it to say, there has indeed been positive developments in terms of lawmaking, policy setting on paper, and even resolve of many government workers painstakingly trying to make the Philippines a better place to live in. My office has extensively worked with the government, and I can attest to the intent of many government workers to make the system work. But they are also constrained by political leaders. This is where the theoretical aspects meet the realities as outlined in the Philippine Report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Philippines has a number of institutional challenges: structural inequality, weak institutions, political dynasties, and poor implementation of the law, to name a few. Weak institutions brought about by the Marcos dictatorship has damaged the check and balance mechanisms necessary for a democratic state. Its repair is where many technical assistance and aid have been focusing to strengthen our democratic institutions, including the justice pillar. The vast unequal distribution of wealth and power shows the structural inequality. Our Constitution devoted a whole portion on social justice and human rights due to these inequalities. The political landscape has also been dominated by political dynasties. Based on empirical studies, these political dynasties thrive from patronage politics by ensuring that constituencies remain disempowered. These weigh down on good governance, the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law, all of which are needed by a democratic state. The well-documented high incidence of warrantless arrests and killings in the more recent years show how due process of law has been stretched to the limit, if not eroded. Too wide discretion has been exercised by law enforcers. As we speak, the imminence of an anti-terrorism law hovers, giving wider discretion for warrantless arrests. There is distrust. How can you blame those who oppose these measures when the environment has been one that allows abuse, one with difficult chances of accountability for excesses? When those who exercise legitimate dissent are vilified to their detriment, legitimate dissent has been under attack. Even social media and traditional media outlets find themselves besieged with legal woes for being perceived as critical. The barriers to access to justice do not help our situation at all. But in any challenge, I believe matters should not be seen as insurmountable. Rather than attacks, this is an opportunity to improve a system that the Philippine government has admittedly been trying to address itself. To this Human Rights Council, I pray that the issues brought here not be decided based on quid pro quo arrangements. People's lives depend on you. An independent and transparent fact-finding mission will help the Philippine government in its own quest to build accountability and address impunity. The international community can assist the Philippine government rebuild its trust with the people, one not merely based on popular support, but on its adherence on international human rights standards. I humbly recommend to the Philippine government to continue cooperating with international human rights mechanisms, but more closely this time. It must show its resolve to pursue honest-to-goodness accountability beyond the rhetoric. The Philippine government has demonstrated that it has the ability to do so, like in the case of the minor Kian de los Santos. It must provide for reparation and psychosocial intervention for victims. And finally, if there is political will to push for an anti-terrorism law, I hope that it also finds the political will to pass a human rights defenders law. I, together with my university, as well as with many other civil society groups, remain steadfast to work with our government in principled partnership. Thank you again, Your Excellencies.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to point out that the list of speakers has meanwhile been closed, and I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the presenters and make comments on their statements, and we'll start with Finland on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. We share the High Commissioner's concern outlined in the report over killings committed in the context of the so-called war on drugs, as well as that of human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers and trade unionists. Indications that these violations are widespread, of a systematic character and on a large scale are of a particular concern. Urgent steps must be taken to ensure full accountability. We reiterate our concerns regarding reports of ongoing threats to freedom of expression and media freedom, with legal charges and prosecutions being brought against journalists and senior politicians, critical of the government, as well as actions to shut down media outlets. The recent convictions of journalists Maria Ressa and Reynaldo Santos are particularly worrying. Madam President, as outlined in the report, the Philippines have taken important steps on universal access to tertiary education, access to health and protection of children in situations of armed conflict. We appreciate that they have presented further information on their approach and their efforts to address concerns outlined in the report. We encourage the government to deepen its cooperation with OHCHR to implement the recommendations outlined in the report and look forward to continuing our dialogue. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and I can see that the list of speakers still doesn't appear on all screens. So the next speakers will be the European Union, followed by Vietnam and then Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Madam President. The EU would like to thank the High Commissioner for a well-researched report. We are pleased that the government has cooperated, although the OHCHR did not receive permission to visit. The EU would like to reiterate our concern at the death toll and call for investigations of all cases. We also encourage the authorities to investigate harassment of human rights defenders, journalists, religious leaders and indigenous people. The EU calls on the government to continue keeping the Philippines a country without death penalty and to review the Anti-Terrorism Act. We also urge the Philippines to uphold its commitments under the CRC. The report mentions the killing of 73 children. The youngest victim was only 5 years old. The conviction of Maria Ressa and Reynaldo Santos raises serious doubts over the respect for the rights to freedom of expression and the rule of law. The shutdown of ABS-CBN is another example. The EU is engaged with Philippines within the area of justice reform and is keen on discussing further, including on the first meeting of the Subcommittee on Good Governance, Rule of Law and Human Rights. Madam High Commissioner, your report recommends fostering trust with civil society organizations without reprisals. How can we support this work? Also, the report recommends considering options for international accountability in the absence of measurable domestic outcomes. What would be the sources for assessing the outcomes of all this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And the next speaker is Vietnam on behalf of ASEAN.
I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the ASEAN member states. We welcome efforts of the Philippines in providing information and discussing technical cooperation with the OCHA and its sharing of the Philippine human rights situation. We note the information provided on technical cooperation with international partners, along with the NHRI and civil society, enhancement of the rule of law, and national accountability mechanisms. We are pleased to note the Philippines' readiness to engage OCHA in further strengthening national mechanism on addressing extralegal killings, creating a monitoring system to document human rights violations among police force, and setting up a platform to facilitate the monitoring of the implementation of human rights recommendations. ASEAN underscores the work of the Council must uphold and assist the role of states as primary human rights duty bearers. Efforts must be exerted to encourage all parties to avail of and exhort domestic accountability processes. ASEAN underscores the role of the Council in delivering, through constructive dialogue and cooperation, concrete and meaningful human rights impact on the ground. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And I pass the floor to Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Madam President. Liechtenstein thanks the High Commissioner for her report on the situation of the human rights in the Philippines. We are appalled by the widespread and systematic killings related to the drug campaign carried out by the security forces of the government of the Philippines. The report suggests that according to official data, 8,663 people, among which 73 children, the youngest at the age of only 5 months, have been killed since July 2016, estimating that up to a triple of that number might reflect the reality. The report also verifies that killings of at least 208 human rights defenders, journalists, trade unionists, including 30 women, for the period between January 2015 and December 2019. Liechtenstein appreciates the last week's appeal of 23 UN special mandate holders calling on the human rights to establish an international investigation into the human rights situation in the Philippines. In this regard, we would like to recall the ongoing investigation by the International Criminal Court into the situation in the Philippines. We express our regret that the Philippines have left the Rome Statute while having been investigated. This shows that the government of the Philippines does not undertake all possible efforts to protect and prevent its population from the most serious crimes and combat impunity for the killings of the past 5 years. For this reason, we call upon the Human Rights Council to appropriately react to this situation. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. And the next speaker is Canada.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the High Commissioner for her report. We're encouraged by the Philippines' openness to dialogue with the OHCHR, but regret that the High Commissioner was not invited to visit the Philippines in the course of its work. Canada is deeply concerned by the finding that drug campaign-related killings appear to be widespread and systematic in nature. We noted that some administrative measures have been imposed, including the dismissal of some police officers. However, misconduct and criminal action must also be addressed. Canada supports the report's call for prompt, impartial, thorough, and transparent investigations into all cases of death and alleged violations of human rights. We are also deeply troubled by the increasing criticism and intimidation of the press and the deliberate targeting of human rights defenders as well as journalists. In a democracy, human rights defenders and journalists must be able to do their work freely and without the fear of reprisal. Canada welcomes improvements in the protection of economic and social rights, such as agrarian reform, universal health care, and social assistance payments in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, and calls on the Philippines to continue its work towards full and meaningful social, economic, cultural, and civic participation of people in their communities. High Commissioner, your report has identified a particularly alarming climate for human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists. In your view, how can the international community support the government of the Philippines to ensure that these vulnerable groups have access to effective legal remedies? Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next speaker is Belgium.
Thank you, Madam President. Belgium fully aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Thank you, Madam High Commissioner, for your report. Belgium welcomes the engagement of the government of the Philippines with the Office of the High Commissioner in the preparation of this report. We call upon the government to continue cooperating with the High Commissioner and to allow OHCHR to enter the country. Belgium also invites the Philippines to respond positively to outstanding requests for visits of special procedures. Belgium is shocked by the credible allegations of widespread and systematic extrajudicial killings and arbitrary detentions in the context of the campaign against illegal drugs. We call on the Philippines to ensure prompt, independent, and credible investigations. Those responsible for human rights violations must be held accountable. Your findings on the lack of adequate human rights safeguards in the national security legislative framework, the phenomenon of red tagging, and the intimidating and sometimes even lethal impact thereof on civic space and on human rights defenders are equally of great concern. Belgium calls on the Philippines to uphold its international human rights obligations. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the United Nations Children's Fund.
Thank you, Madam President. Children in the Philippines are indeed exposed to multiple risks and violations of their rights. During the lockdown, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children indicated an increase in online sexual exploitation and abuse reports by around 260% compared to the previous year. Children living in marginalized urban communities continue to be impacted by aggressive law enforcement in the context of the government's campaign against illegal substance abuse. The Philippines has one of the lowest age to determine statutory rape globally at 12 years old. Also, there has been recurrent attempts to lower the minimum age of criminal responsibility from 15 to 12 or even 9. Despite the promulgation of Republic Act 11188 on the special protection of children in situations of armed conflict in 2019, reports on grave violations against children, including recruitment, killing, maiming, and attacks on schools remain frequent. Moreover, the anticipated promulgation of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 risks to further jeopardize children's rights and make children more vulnerable to warrantless arrest and detention. In this context, we call on the government to bring its laws and practice in line with the Convention on the Right of the Child, and we stand ready to support. Furthermore, in line with our global call to release detained children amid the COVID-19 pandemic, we ask the government to facilitate the safe release of detained children, refrain from resorting to pretrial detention, and expand the provision of restorative alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is China.
是，中方积极评价菲律宾政府为促进经济发展、消除贫困、保障民众各项人权所做的努力和取得的成就，支持菲律宾政府为打击毒品犯罪、维护社会治安采取的执法行动。中方一贯主张各方通过对话与合作处理人权领域分歧，反对利用国别决议向会员国施压。中方在人权理事会第41届会议上对菲律宾的决议投了反对票。我们认为，人权高专办在工作中应坚持公正客观原则，尊重会员国为促进保护人权所做努力，重视会员国政府提供的权威信息，摒弃偏见和先入为主的做法，与会员国政府开展建设性对话与合作。谢谢主席女士。
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель, рассмотрение в СПЧ филиппинского сюжета является примером откровенной политизации деятельности правозащитного измерения ООН, не способствует поощрению прав человека в мире и, кроме того, дискредитирует Совет. В мире нет государств, свободных от нарушений прав человека, но свои правозащитные проблемы они должны решать сами, а международное сообщество должно оказывать в этом содействие по их запросу и с их согласия. Приветствуем принятые правительством Филиппин меры по улучшению ситуации с правами человека, о которых оно подробно информирует органы международного контроля, включая СПЧ. Не можем согласиться с большинством оценок ситуации на Филиппинах, приведенных в докладе. В то же время поручение, которое было адресовано Верховному комиссару прошлогодней резолюцией, не предусматривает объективности или нейтральности в оценках и отражает позицию государств, политизирующих ООНовское правозащитное измерение. Доклад ярко иллюстрирует бесполезность и контрпродуктивность инициативы по Филиппинам в СПЧ. Мы не видим необходимости в ее продолжении. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Thailand.
Aligns itself with the ASEAN joint statement and takes note of the High Commissioner's report. A human rights situation in every country is unique and in most cases very complex in itself. Thailand is pleased to see that the Philippines and the OHCHR are engaging in dialogue. We believe that constructive dialogue as well as the provision of technical cooperation are key to improve human rights situation and good governance in the country. We welcome the Philippines' efforts to uphold its human rights obligations, including the strengthening of national accountability mechanisms to address alleged human rights violations, the investment in legal and institutional mechanisms to prevent impunity, as well as the promotion of the role of the NHRI and people's participation to ensure transparency. Thailand finds it essential to tackle human rights challenges at their root causes, especially through the implementation of all recommendations from relevant human rights mechanisms. We also view that the consideration to establish any new international accountability mechanism must only come after the exhaustion of domestic mechanism and remedies. As a fellow ASEAN country, Thailand stands ready to work closely with the Philippines and relevant UN and regional human rights mechanisms where appropriate to continue to promote and protect human rights for all. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Venezuela.
Gracias, Presidenta. Filipinas mantiene un diálogo franco y transparente con este Consejo y sus mecanismos. El gobierno filipino continúa fortaleciendo su sistema de administración de justicia, lo cual es una prioridad en ese país que vela por la seguridad, el bienestar y los derechos humanos de su pueblo. Expresamos nuestro beneplácito por la determinación de su gobierno de mantener un enfoque objetivo en el abordaje e investigación de las alegaciones sobre las presuntas violaciones a los derechos humanos. El informe presentado no refleja la exhaustiva información proporcionada por Filipinas sobre la cooperación de su gobierno con la Institución Nacional de Derechos Humanos, las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y los actores internacionales. Continuaremos apoyando a Filipinas en sus esfuerzos por la vigencia de los derechos humanos en su territorio con miras a generar un impacto positivo y significativo en el bienestar de su pueblo. Venezuela reitera la necesidad de que este Consejo cumpla con su mandato de promover y proteger los derechos humanos en el mundo mediante el diálogo genuino y la cooperación, pilares fundamentales de su labor, sin imposiciones, politización, selectividad ni dobles raseros. Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Muchas gracias. Next speaker is Saudi Arabia, please.
السيد الرئيس، اطلعت بعثة بلادي على تقرير المفوض السامي عن حالة حقوق الإنسان في الفلبين، وترحب بالتطورات الإيجابية الهادفة التي اتخذتها الفلبين في السنوات الأخيرة، بما في ذلك تمرير قوانين لتعزيز حقوق الإنسان ومصادقة الفلبين على 8 صكوك دولية أساسية لحقوق الإنسان. السيد الرئيس، إن آفة المخدرات هي من أكبر المشاكل التي يواجهها العالم وليس فقط الفلبين، لما لها من آثار واسعة النطاق على الصحة والأسر والمجتمعات وكذلك الأمن والتنمية المستدامة، بالإضافة لكون المخدرات أيضا من المسببات الرئيسية في انتشار الجريمة والجريمة المنظمة، خلاف ضررها على أفراد المجتمعات وتشتيتها للأسر وإصابتهم بالأمراض النفسية والذهنية. كما أن هناك حاجة ماسة لمكافحة هذه الآفة لخطورتها على المجتمع في ظل ازدياد تجارتها وتعاطيها لعدة عوامل، من أهمها زيادة تجارة وتهريب المواد المخدرة غير المشروعة واستخدام أساليب جديدة للتهريب مع انتشار وسائل التقنية ووسائل الاتصال. السيد الرئيس، تأمل بعثة بلادي أن تكون التقارير المعدة تستقي معلوماتها من مصادر موثوقة وموضوعية وحيادية، ونؤكد على أن تعزيز حقوق الإنسان يتطلب حوارا بناء وتعاونا مع الدولة المضيفة، حيث أن الدولة هي التي تتحمل المسؤولية الأساسية عن تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان الخاصة بها. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you very much. Je donne la parole à la France.
Madame la Présidente, Madame la Haute Commissaire, nous vous remercions pour votre rapport sur la situation des droits de l'homme aux Philippines. Nous saluons la coopération des autorités philippines avec vos équipes. Nous les encourageons vivement à la poursuivre ainsi qu'à mettre en œuvre vos recommandations. Et par ailleurs, mon pays souhaite que les instances de dialogue sur les droits de l'homme établies dans le cadre du partenariat entre l'Union européenne et les Philippines soient mises en place. La France est préoccupée par la situation des droits de l'homme décrite dans votre rapport, Madame la Haute Commissaire. Plusieurs points appellent plus particulièrement notre attention. D'abord, pour légitime qu'il soit, le combat contre le trafic de drogue ne saurait priver les justiciables de leur droit à un procès équitable, ni justifier l'impunité dont les auteurs d'exécutions extrajudiciaires ont pu bénéficier, notamment depuis 2016. Mon pays appelle les autorités philippines à empêcher de nouvelles exécutions extrajudiciaires et à lutter contre l'impunité de leurs auteurs. Par ailleurs, la restriction de l'espace de la société civile fait également l'objet de vives préoccupations, en particulier la poursuite de la procédure judiciaire concernant Maria Ressa et Reinaldo Santos, qui doit être conduite en toute indépendance et dans le respect des principes de l'état des droits, y compris des droits de la défense. La France rappelle son attachement partout dans le monde à la liberté de la presse et à la liberté d'expression. Madame la Haute Commissaire, vous recommandez aux autorités philippines d'établir un mécanisme d'enquête visant à combattre l'impunité des auteurs de violations des droits de l'homme. Que recommanderiez-vous comme mesure aux autorités philippines afin d'assurer la transparence, l'indépendance et l'impartialité de ce mécanisme? Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Et je donne la parole à Koweït.
سيدة الرئيسة، اطلع وفد بلادي على التقرير المقدم من قبل مفوضة السامية للأمم المتحدة لحقوق الإنسان، وأخذ علم لما جاء في حالة حقوق الإنسان في الفلبين. هذا واطلع على الجهود التي بذلتها الحكومة الفلبينية والإجراءات المتخذة من قبلها لإرساء الأمن والاستقرار وحماية جميع الفلبين. لقد أخذ وفد بلادي علم بانفتاح الحكومة الفلبينية للعمل مع جميع الأطراف المحلية والدولية لمعالجة الادعاءات والمزاعم المتعلقة بانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان، وذلك على أساس الوقائع والبراهين وفي إطار سيادة القانون وإطار المساءلة الوطنية. ونحن ندعو مجلس حقوق الإنسان الموقر للسعي إلى دعم الآليات والعمليات المحلية وعدم تقويضها وبما يتماشى مع مبادئ القانون الدولي. وإن دولة الكويت ترحب بأنشطة التعاون التقني مع الشركاء الدوليين بما فيها تعزيز الآلية الوطنية تجاه مسألة القتل خارج الإطار القضائي وإنشاء مرصد لحقوق الإنسان وتطوير أداء مؤشر الجريمة وغيرها من أمور متبعة نشجع مجلس حقوق الإنسان في التعاون البناء بشكل أكثر في شأنها. ختاما يؤكد وفد بلادي أهمية استمرار التعاون التقني والبناء ما بين مكتب المفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان وحكومة الفلبينية، والتي يدعوها إلى استمرارية الإبقاء على المشاركة المفتوحة والصريحة والفاعلة مع الأمم المتحدة وآليات حقوق الإنسان والمجتمع المدني بما يتضمن حالة حقوق الإنسان في الفلبين. وشكرا سيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Sri Lanka.
Madam President, we note Philippines' constructive engagement with the UN human rights mechanisms, including the OHCHR, notwithstanding its opposition to the country-specific resolution adopted by this Council. Madam President, Sri Lanka highlights that any action in the promotion and protection of human rights of a country should have the consent of that country, based on the principles of cooperation and genuine dialogue, and on the principles of universality, impartiality, and non-selectivity, which govern the work of this Council, as stipulated in GA Resolution 65251 and the IB package. In this context, we believe that the UPR is the appropriate mechanism to address the human rights situation of all countries in a uniform, objective, and constructive engagement, where countries could meaningfully and effectively contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights without discrimination. Madam President, in conclusion, we encourage this Council to engage in a positive dialogue with the Philippines, giving due regard to the tangible developments on the ground, as well as the cooperation demonstrated by the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Syria.
الرئيسة، يحيط وفدي علما بالتقرير المقدم حول الحالة في الفلبين، كما نحيط علما مع التقدير بالجهود التي تبذلها حكومة الفلبين لتعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان لمواطنيها وللحفاظ على النمو الاقتصادي الشامل في بيئة سليمة وآمنة لشعبها، وذلك على الرغم من التحديات التي تواجهها لا سيما المتصلة بمكافحة المخدرات والحفاظ على الأمن والاستقرار في البلاد ضد الجماعات الإرهابية المسلحة. ويأخذ وفدي علما بالتعاون القائم مع آليات حقوق الإنسان الدولية استنادا إلى الالتزامات التي تعهدت بها الدولة الفلبينية. نجدد التأكيد على موقفنا بوجوب أن يكون مجلس حقوق الإنسان منتدى للحوار البناء والتعاون الدولي لدعم جهود الدول في بناء قدراتها لتعزيز واحترام جميع حقوق الإنسان بما فيها الحق في التنمية على قدم المساواة ودون تمييز بينها، مع الأخذ بالاعتبار التحديات الوطنية والدولية التي تواجه الدول الأعضاء في هذا الإطار وخصوصيات كل دولة. وندعو لعدم إضعاف المجلس عبر رهنه لرؤى وأجندات خاصة تستخدم حقوق الإنسان لتحقيق أهداف سياسية. وتدعو سوريا المجلس لمراجعة التوسع غير المسبوق في عمل الآليات الخاصة في ظل الأزمة المالية التي تواجه الأمم المتحدة، وذلك تعزيزا لعملية تفعيل كفاءة المجلس. شكرا.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Australia.
Thank you, Madam President. Australia thanks the High Commissioner for Human Rights for her report on the situation of human rights in the Philippines and welcomes engagement by the Government of the Philippines with the Office of the High Commissioner during the preparation of the report, including high-level engagement today through Justice Secretary Guevara. Australia also welcomes the High Commissioner's recognition of the Philippine government's efforts to improve the protection of economic and social rights. Australia acknowledges these efforts and notes the benefits in addressing systemic challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, by leaving no one behind with respect for human rights. Australia shares the High Commissioner's concerns of reports of extrajudicial killings and other serious human rights violations in the Philippines, including those affecting journalists, human rights defenders, those accused of using narcotics, lawyers and trade unionists, for which domestic mechanisms should ensure greater accountability. Today's announcement by Justice Secretary Guevara of a new mechanism is a very welcome development in this regard. Australia notes that the Philippines faces a significant threat from terrorists and will continue to work with the Philippines to ensure that its counter-terrorism legislation provides an appropriate framework for responding to this threat, consistent with its international obligations, including those relating to human rights. Australia welcomes the recommendations in the report with regard to cooperation with UN human rights mechanisms and the provision of technical assistance. We encourage the Philippines to continue engagement with OHCHR, and we remain committed to supporting and assisting the Philippines in this regard.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. Next speaker on our list would be Spain, but is absent. So I give the floor to Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. We take note of the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the situation of human rights in the Philippines and welcome the government's constructive engagement with the OHCHR. There is a need for OHCHR to have more transparency and objectivity in its methodology, especially in country reports, and to ensure the highest level of professionalism. We commend the Philippines' efforts to strengthen accountability mechanisms. The efforts by the government to ensure the right to health of the drug-affected populations are noteworthy. As a country that is neighboring one of the main sources of opium production and has long been facing the scourge of illicit drug trafficking, Iran understands very well the difficulties the Philippines has to deal with. The international community is expected to shoulder their responsibility and assist all countries that are fighting illicit drug trafficking. To conclude, we appreciate all the efforts by the Philippines to safeguard human rights and human dignity while countering illicit drug trafficking and abuse. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Jordan.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيدة الرئيسة يشكر وفد بلادي السيد المفوض السامي على إحاطتها للمجلس ويأخذ علما بالتقرير المقدم ضمن هذا البند ويشير إلى ما يلي. لقد حققت دولة الفلبين الصديقة إنجازات متعددة في مجال تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان فيها، ولا سيما في مجالات الحقوق الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والثقافية وغيرها. وتقوم الحكومة الفلبينية بجهود أساسية مضنية تهدف للتصدي لانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان، وذلك من خلال الآليات الوطنية القائمة، وتعمل على تعزيز الآليات المساءلة والتحقيق بمختلف الادعاءات والتجاوزات. كما تواصل حكومة الفلبين الحوار مع المفوضية السامية بشأن العديد من القضايا المشار إليها في التقرير مدار البحث، ونحثهما على استدامة الحوار وتطوير البرامج حسب الأولويات الوطنية وبما يعزز منظومة حقوق الإنسان فيها. وفي الختام نؤكد أهمية التشاور والحوار بين المفوضية السامية والدول المعنية بما يخدم صالح حقوق الإنسان ويبتعد عن التسييس والانتقائية والاستقطاب. وشكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Luxembourg.
Madame la Présidente, Madame la Haute Commissaire, le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne. Nous remercions la Haute Commissaire pour son rapport. Nous encourageons le gouvernement des Philippines à coopérer pleinement avec la Haute Commissaire, les mandataires des procédures spéciales et les organes conventionnels. Ma délégation est très inquiète de l'évolution des violences et des violations des droits de l'homme, notamment dans le cadre de la campagne anti-drogue. Nous faisons appel aux autorités de faire cesser les exécutions extrajudiciaires, les détentions arbitraires et d'autres violations des droits humains visant des personnes soupçonnées de narcotrafic ou des toxicomanes. La décongestion des centres de détention dans le cadre de la lutte contre la pandémie de la COVID-19 est une initiative louable et nous encourageons le gouvernement de continuer de travailler dans cette direction. Nous estimons que la liberté d'opinion et d'expression en ligne et hors ligne sont des éléments essentiels de la démocratie. Nous nous inquiétons dès lors de la rhétorique néfaste qui est utilisée sur les canaux officiels et qui peut inciter à la violence. Nous déplorons en outre les condamnations récentes de Maria Ressa et de Reynaldo Santos. Nous encourageons les Philippines d'enquêter sur les meurtres des défenseurs des droits de l'homme, des journalistes et des autres personnes travaillant dans le secteur des médias. Je vous en remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, and I apologize. I made a mistake. I should have called Belarus 2 speakers earlier. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Госпожа председатель, мы не перестаем обращать внимание Совета на контрпродуктивность принятия решений, которые не способствуют поощрению защиты прав человека на местах и только больше отодвигают перспективу в этом деле. К таким решениям мы относим и резолюцию о правах человека на Филиппинах, в соответствии с которой проводится этот интерактивный диалог. Мы внимательно ознакомились с докладом Верховного комиссара о положении в области прав человека на Филиппинах. Скажем кратко, мы сожалеем, что были отвлечены значительные ресурсы и время УВКПЧ на работу, которая не рассматривается нами в качестве очевидной и требующей внимания СПЧ. Мы приветствуем взаимодействие правительства Филиппин с УВКПЧ, в том числе по предоставлению информации для подготовки доклада. Не каждая страна в условиях конфронтационной резолюции готова пойти на такой шаг открытости. Беларусь вновь подчеркивает необходимость рассмотрения вопросов прав человека на основе взаимоуважительного диалога. Филиппины не согласились с принятой резолюцией, и это является для нас важным сигналом и показателем того, что резолюция бесперспективна и бесполезна. Поэтому выступаем за снятие вопроса о правах человека на Филиппинах с рассмотрения в СПЧ. Благодарю.
Thank you, Ambassador, and again, apologies. I now give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam President. Indonesia associates itself with the statement of ASEAN. While we note the several challenges remain relating to the human rights situation in the Philippines, we welcome the Philippines' recent step to address these challenges. We take note of the Philippines' constructive engagement and cooperation with OHCHR as reflected in several rounds of exchanges this year. Further, my delegation welcomes efforts by the government of the Philippines in improving rule of law and accountability mechanism at the national level, among others, through the strengthening of human rights safeguard within its national legal framework. Indonesia wishes to encourage the Philippines to continue in taking steps to further improve human rights situation on the ground. In this regard, we support the efforts of the Philippines to explore relevant areas of technical cooperation and institutional capacity building at the international level. As a fellow members of ASEAN, Indonesia stands ready to continue working closely with the Philippines to further promote meaningful advancement in the field of human rights. Indonesia also calls upon the international community to continue its constructive cooperation with and assistance to the Philippines. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I give the floor to the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, the Lao PDR allied itself with the ASEAN statement and expressed its sincere thanks to the High Commissioner for her report on the human rights situation in the Philippines. The Lao PDR takes note of the achievement made by the Philippines in the areas of human rights in the country, particularly through the economic and social inclusion policies with a view to reducing poverty, promoting social inclusion, and building stable conditions for sustained and inclusive economic growth. We are encouraged by the Philippines' continued engagement with the human rights mechanisms and treaty bodies to address claims or allegations of violation on the basis of facts. We also encourage the Council and the OHCHR to constructively engage with the Philippines and to support the government's ongoing efforts to further strengthen the rule of law and domestic accountability mechanisms so as to further protect the welfare and human rights of its people. Madam President, the Lao PDR would like to emphasize the importance of the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, constructive international dialogue, and cooperation. These are core guiding principles, ensuring effectiveness of the Human Rights Council. Therefore, they should be strictly observed. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Japan.
Japan takes note of the report of the High Commissioner. The international community should take a constructive approach to improve the human rights situation in the Philippines. On the situation of grave drug contamination in the Philippines, Japan highly values the strong commitment of the Philippines under the leadership of President Duterte to illegal drugs control as one of its highest priority issues, which is highly supported by the Philippine people. In this respect, Japan's position is as mentioned in our EOV last year at the 41st session of the Council. In this context, Japan expects that accountability be ensured in the Philippines' fight against illegal drugs. We appreciate the country's efforts in further strengthening various domestic accountability mechanisms in cooperation with the OHCHR in order to improve the human rights situation and enhance the rule of law. To bring about real improvement on the ground, Japan provides assistance to the Philippines, such as construction of rehabilitation facilities and formulation of drug addiction remedies. Japan takes note of the Philippine Human Rights Stationer. We also welcome the Philippines' continued dialogue with special rapporteurs and cooperation with stakeholders, including the EU. We expect the Philippines and the international community to continue constructive dialogues. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Et je donne la parole au Maroc.
President, but we informed the Secretariat earlier that we withdrew from the list of speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next speaker is Cambodia.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, my delegation would like to associate ourselves with the statement of the ASEAN delivered earlier. Cambodia appreciates endeavors of the government of the Philippines to continue bettering the life of Filipino citizens and is pleased to note the vibrancy of the media freedom evidenced through the presence of thousands of media outlets as well as the open space for thousands of registered CSO in the national development. Cambodia further recognizes the determination and importance that the Philippines attaches to constructive engagement with stakeholders and international community, including OHCHR, in promoting and protecting human rights. This demonstrates the country's openness and good faith to constructive dialogues and cooperation with the human rights mechanisms. Madam President, it is imperative that the role of state as the primary human rights duty bearer be upheld and assisted, not denigrated. The best approach to address human rights issue is engagement. Therefore, all country mandates should be established consensually with consent and cooperation of the nation concerned. Otherwise, such mandates are counterproductive and deplete the Council resources. Lastly, Cambodia reiterates its principal positions that human rights issue agenda must be addressed through a genuine dialogue-based approach with non-confrontation, non-politicization, and non-selectivity, based on verified source of information, bearing in mind the national particularity of each country. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Bahrain.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation has reviewed with interest the report prepared by the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in the Philippines. We would like to thank the High Commissioner for her continued efforts in the promotion of human rights worldwide, as well as the government of the Philippines for their cooperation with the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms. Madam President, the Kingdom of Bahrain commends the efforts deployed by the Philippines in the enhancement of the rule of law and domestic international accountability mechanisms. We pay tribute as well as to the efforts made by the government of the Philippines in combating terrorism and drug trafficking to ensure for its citizens a safe environment allowing them to enjoy their fundamental rights. Madam President, finally, my delegation encourages the government of the Philippines to enhance the cooperation with the international human rights mechanisms and the Office of the High Commissioner with the view to maintain a close collaboration between the two parties. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Iraq.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. إن المبدأ الأساسي لحقوق الإنسان في الأمم المتحدة هو أن تتحمل الدول المسؤولية القانونية والأخلاقية في تعزيز وحماية حقوق مواطنيها وفقا لالتزاماتها الدولية. ولدى مجلس حقوق الإنسان العديد من الآليات التي تساعد الدول في معالجة شواغل حقوق الإنسان مثل آلية الاستعراض الدوري الشامل دون أن تستغل بصيغة تحمل في طياتها جوانب سياسية، فهذا أمر يتعارض مع روح عمل هذا المجلس. أكد العراق في مناسبات عديدة على أهمية التأكد من مصداقية مصادر المعلومات التي تستخدم في التقارير الأممية وعدم الانتقائية والتحيز، كما أكدنا على ضرورة أن تعكس ردود الدول وتعاونها والتسهيلات التي تقدمها لأصحاب الولايات في التقارير ذاتها. ختاما نؤكد على ضرورة اتباع معايير موحدة تطبق على جميع الدول دون استثناء، وأهمية التشاور مع الدول المعنية عند النظر في قضايا حقوق الإنسان في العالم. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is New Zealand.
Madam President, New Zealand welcomes the Government of the Philippines' substantive engagement with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the preparation of this report. Firstly, New Zealand acknowledges the strong relationship between our two countries. We also recognise that the country faces a range of complex internal challenges, such as poverty, armed conflict, terrorism, and illegal drugs. However, responding to these challenges must be done in accordance with international human rights law. We are concerned by the report's findings that a heavy-handed focus on countering national security threats and illegal drugs has resulted in serious human rights violations. These include reports of extrajudicial killings and arbitrary detentions. New Zealand also continues to be concerned about the vilification, harassment, and killings of persons exercising their rights to freedom of expression, such as human rights defenders and journalists. We urge the Government of the Philippines to undertake effective, prompt, independent, and impartial investigations into all allegations of serious violations and abuses of international human rights law, and to hold perpetrators accountable. Finally, New Zealand would like to encourage the Government of the Philippines to cooperate with the United Nations system, including the Office of the High Commissioner, who is ready to constructively and concretely support the Philippines to promote and protect human rights. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. High Commissioner, we thank you for the thorough report and we fully support your analysis and recommendations. We welcome the constructive approach of the Philippines today to discuss the report and its follow-up. Human Rights Council members ought to live up to the highest human rights standards. We acknowledge recent steps taken by the Philippines to improve the human rights situation in the country, notably the laws that were passed to advance human rights, including on universal access to tertiary education and healthcare and sexual harassment. However, we remain concerned about the continued extrajudicial killings related to the campaign against illegal drugs and the position of civic space, as also mentioned in the report. We therefore support the report's call to put an end to all extrajudicial killings and to empower an independent body to conduct prompt, impartial and transparent investigations into all cases of death. We also encourage the Philippine authorities to investigate reports of harassment and killings of human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, media workers and religious leaders. High Commissioner, what role do you see for OHHR in fostering the implementation of the report's recommendations? I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Lebanon.
السيدة الرئيسة، يشكر لبنان المفوضة السامية على تقريرها حول حالة حقوق الإنسان في الفلبين، وانطلاقا من العلاقات المميزة التي تجمع البلدين، يرحب لبنان بتعاون الفلبين المتواصل مع المجتمع الدولي فيما يخص مسائل حقوق الإنسان، إذ يتبين هذا التعاون بوضوح من خلال التحديث المقدم حول حالة حقوق الإنسان في الفلبين. ونرحب أيضا بالجهود القائمة لإشراك شركاء دوليين في عدد كبير من أنشطة التعاون التقني المرتبطة بتعزيز حالة حقوق الإنسان ومبدأي سيادة القانون والمساءلة. ونشجع الفلبين على مواصلة تعاونها البناء في هذا الصدد، كما وندعو المفوضة السامية لحقوق الإنسان وهذا المجلس الموقر على تقديم الدعم الكامل للآليات والإجراءات الوطنية من أجل ضمان مواصلة تعزيز حقوق الإنسان واحترامها. شكرا سيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Austria.
Thank you, Madam President. Austria fully aligns itself with the statement by the European Union. We thank the High Commissioner for her report and welcome the openness of the Philippines to engage in a dialogue with OHCHR during the preparation thereof. Preventing attacks against journalists and combating impunity has long been one of the priority issues of the Austrian human rights policy. We welcome the Philippines' plan of action on the safety of journalists and the country's cooperation with UNESCO on this issue. At the same time, we remain very concerned about the High Commissioner's report indicating a pattern of intimidation of independent news sources. We are worried about what appear to be politically motivated charges against journalists, undermining the public's confidence in the rule of law. During the COVID-19 crisis, independent and plural media have proven indispensable for an effective management of public health and for increasing public trust in measures taken by the government. Madam High Commissioner, in your report, you mention ongoing efforts by the Philippine government to fight impunity for violent attacks against journalists, including by the Presidential Task Force on Media Security. What could, in your view, be done to enhance the effectiveness of these efforts? I thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Madam President. Azerbaijan welcomes information provided by the Philippines as a concerned country. We also take positive note of the documents circulated earlier by the Permanent Mission of the Philippines, which provided us with a comprehensive account of the human rights situation in the Philippines, including the country's human rights policies, mechanisms, and accomplishments. We note that the Philippines is a party to most of the international human rights instruments. In compliance with its international obligations, the Philippines cooperates with the existing human rights mechanisms of the United Nations, and it's commendable that the Philippines is among the few countries that keep their treaty body reporting fully up to date. We acknowledge efforts by the government of the Philippines to address human rights violations within established domestic processes and to further strengthen accountability mechanisms. Azerbaijan believes that all outstanding issues should be considered within the spirit of cooperation and dialogue between the Philippines and the OSCHR. To conclude, we reiterate our conviction that selective adoption of country-specific resolutions is counterproductive and undermines principles of cooperation and genuine dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor back to Vietnam.
Madam President, Vietnam associates itself with the joint statement of the ASEAN. Vietnam strongly believes that the most productive way to enhance the promotion and protection of human rights among countries is through genuine dialogue and cooperation, and to uphold the principles of sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs of states. We welcome the determination of the government of the Philippines to integrate the promotion and protection of human rights in the recent Vision 2040 and the Philippines Development Plan for 2017 and 2022, which signified the importance of the Philippines peoples in the process of national building. We also recognize the Philippines' engagement with the UN Human Rights Mechanism, as well as the country's active advocacies at the international level on youth, migrants, anti-trafficking in persons, and climate change, and encourage the country to continue this constructive dialogue and cooperation in the future. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Switzerland.
Madame la Présidente, la Suisse remercie la haute commissaire pour la présentation de son rapport sur la situation des droits de l'homme aux Philippines. Celui-ci confirme les inquiétudes sur l'étendue des exécutions extrajudiciaires perpétuées dans le pays dans le cadre de la lutte contre les drogues illégales. Il souligne qu'elles ont apparemment lieu de façon généralisée et systématique et touchent également des mineurs et des enfants. La Suisse rappelle qu'il est essentiel que tous les cas de décès lors d'interventions des forces de police soient suivis d'une enquête rapide, approfondie, impartiale et transparente, et que les tribunaux garantissent le droit à un procès équitable en toutes circonstances. La Suisse rappelle les Philippines à poursuivre et intensifier leur collaboration avec le Haut-Commissariat aux droits de l'homme et à rapidement mettre en œuvre ces recommandations. La Suisse demande au gouvernement de garantir les droits à la liberté d'expression et la protection des journalistes et des défenseurs des droits de l'homme qui font face à de nombreuses formes d'intimidation et sont victimes des exécutions extrajudiciaires. La Suisse tient à souligner les efforts des Philippines dans la lutte contre la pauvreté et encourage le gouvernement à poursuivre dans cette direction. Madame la Haute Commissaire, Quelles sont les données qui font défaut afin de déterminer l'étendue réelle des cas d'exécution extrajudiciaire aux Philippines? Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. And the next speaker is Iceland.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me to thank the High Commissioner and her office for the comprehensive report, as well as the other participants in today's insightful dialogue. Madam President, the report outlines a worrying human rights situation of widespread, systematic and ongoing violations. Individuals are not only killed in the context of the so-called war on drugs, but OHCHR has verified the killings of over 200 human rights defenders, journalists and trade unionists. The report referred to persistent impunity for human rights violations and notes that the practical obstacles of accessing justice within the country are almost insurmountable. Those that bring attention to the situation face legal challenges, with media networks losing the license to broadcast, and journalists such as Maria Ressa and Reynaldo Santos and senior politicians critical of the government such as Leila de Lima are subject to legal proceedings. These cases constitute a serious threat to freedom of expression and media freedom. Madam President, as the initiator of last year's resolution on the situation of human rights in the Philippines, we regret the initial reaction of the government to the resolution. On the other hand, we greatly appreciate the government's participation in today's dialogue. This dialogue with the Council and OHCHR is key in addressing the recommendations of the report, and we look forward to further engage with all stakeholders on the follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. The United Kingdom thanks the High Commissioner for her report and her work over the past year. The UK notes with concern the issues highlighted in the report, in particular the number of killings associated with the war on drugs, the treatment of human rights defenders and land rights activists, and the prison congestion rate. We urge the government of the Philippines to investigate all deaths related to the war on drugs and implement the recommendations in the High Commissioner's report. The UK remains strongly committed to supporting human rights defenders, land rights activists, and journalists, including in the Philippines. They should be able to operate without fear of reprisal. Madam High Commissioner, the United Kingdom welcomes the steps taken by the government of the Philippines to address the impunity for killings of journalists in the Amputian massacre case. The UK is concerned about the continuing cases against Rappler and its CEO, Maria Ressa, and notes the recent closure of ABS-CBN. What is your view on how to best protect freedom of expression in the Philippines? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I give the floor to Ireland.
Madam President, Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU. Ireland thanks the High Commissioner for her detailed report on the situation of human rights in the Philippines and for the constructive recommendations set out therein. Ireland recognises the significant work undertaken by the government in recent years in securing and vindicating economic and social rights for its people. However, we are concerned by the findings of the High Commissioner, particularly the imposition of restrictions on freedom of expression and the media, highlighted by the prosecution of journalists Maria Ressa and Reynaldo Santos, and by elements of the draft anti-terror law. Freedom of opinion and expression, online and offline, are essential cornerstones of democracy. We urge the government to take swift action to ensure that the media and civil society, including human rights defenders, can freely carry out their work without interference. Ireland, along with the EU, remains committed to supporting the government in strengthening and reforming its justice sector and bolstering the rule of law, including through the Go Just programme. We encourage the government to cooperate with the Office of the High Commissioner and relevant special mandate holders to address the challenges identified in the report. Madam High Commissioner, your report also focuses on the serious human rights violations that have taken place as a result of the ongoing campaign against illegal drugs. How would you advise the international community to advocate for the merits and effectiveness of a human rights-based approach, given the deeply polarised views we have seen? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Myanmar.
Thank you, Madam President. Myanmar aligns itself with the ASEAN statement. Myanmar takes note of the report of the High Commissioner. Myanmar thanks the Philippines for sharing the Philippines' human rights situation. It shows the sincerity and openness of the Philippines government, as well as highlights the need for the government report to be given due weight in assessing country-specific situations. Myanmar welcomes the tremendous effort of the government of the Philippines in protection and promotion of the human rights of its people, especially the vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. The existence of robust civil society and media space in the Philippines is attested to by the presence of 60,000 non-government organizations and around 2,200 private media outlets. Madam President, Myanmar praised the accomplishment of the Philippines government anti-illegal drug campaigns over the years and welcomed the concrete actions taken by the government to strengthen the functioning of the accountability mechanisms. We underscore the need of the OHCHR and the Council to fully support domestic mechanism and its process and refrain from externalizing accountability before exhaustion of the domestic procedures. It is important that OHCHR's country report should constitute the issues reflect the challenges on the ground, such as gravity of terrorism and the illegal drug problem that Philippines is encountering. It is also important that the work of the HRC is based on its core principle of universality, objectivity, impartiality, and non-selectivity. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, tiene la palabra Cuba.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Cuba siempre ha objetado enfoques e iniciativas selectivas contra países en desarrollo, por lo que no apoyó la resolución que dio mandato a este diálogo interactivo. Cuba reitera su clara posición en contra las resoluciones contra países específicos y la necesidad de evitar la politización y la selectividad en las labores del Consejo. Con el establecimiento del examen periódico universal, se abrió la posibilidad de promover una genuina cooperación internacional en materia de derechos humanos, que está cada vez menos presente en otros mecanismos del Consejo. Lamentamos que este importante tema de la agenda continúe plagado, cada vez más, de ejercicios sobre determinados países en desarrollo, en lugar de dedicarlo a la discusión fructífera sobre los trabajos de la alta comisionada y su oficina. Señora Presidenta, reiteramos que la cooperación y el diálogo respetuoso deben caracterizar las labores del Consejo y ser las vías para abordar cualquier preocupación en materia de derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra Nicaragua.
Gracias, señora Presidenta. Nicaragua reconoce la buena voluntad y el compromiso constructivo del Gobierno de Filipinas con la comunidad internacional y los mecanismos de Naciones Unidas. Agradecemos la información compartida por Filipinas sobre su participación en distintas actividades de cooperación técnica sobre derechos humanos y Estado de Derecho, e invitamos a los Estados miembros a que tomen nota de ello. Por otra parte, acogemos con beneplácito las acciones desarrolladas por Filipinas para fortalecer el funcionamiento de los mecanismos de rendición de cuentas. Lamentamos que este informe no plasme los esfuerzos que Filipinas ha logrado en la protección y promoción de los derechos humanos para su pueblo. Este Consejo debe procurar los reportes de países no sean usados como medio para justificar acciones delictivas que atentan contra la paz de nuestras naciones. Señora Presidenta, es importante que los informes aquí presentados alienten a la cooperación constructiva y al respeto entre las naciones, en vez de provocar divisiones que no garanticen ningún apoyo a nuestros pueblos para establecer una paz sólida y duradera. Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Muchas gracias. And this brings us to the end of the list of speakers on behalf of states. So we now pass to the list of speakers on behalf of NGOs. And we'll start with the World Organization Against Torture.
Thank you, Madam President. We welcome the report of the High Commissioner on the Philippines, shedding light on gross human rights violations perpetrated in the context of President Duterte's so-called war on drugs. Extrajudicial killings of children, particularly serious given children's heightened vulnerability, remain, however, underreported. In a research published this week, OMCT and its local partner documented 122 killings of children, aged from 1 to 17 years old, between July 2016 and December 2019. 38.5% of these killings were carried out by policemen as part of police operations, while 61% were executed by unknown individuals, some of them with direct links to the police. Only one of these crimes was genuinely investigated, prosecuted, and led to a conviction because it had been recorded on video. Our report identified 4 clear patterns, with children being killed either as direct targets, as proxies when the real targets could not be found, as a result of mistaken identities, or as so-called collateral damage, losing their lives to stray bullets during police operations. Killings continue, with at least another 7 children losing their lives since the beginning of 2020. We call on the government of the Philippines to immediately put an end to extrajudicial killings and call on the Council to act on the recommendation of the High Commissioner to establish an independent international investigation into allegations of gross human rights violations with a specific focus on those committed against children. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Philippines. The Duterte administration has been characterized by widespread and systematic human rights violations in relation to the country's war on drugs. OHCHR's findings confirm reports by civil society on the systematic nature of these violations and the impunity with which they have been committed. Instead of addressing these violations, the government has attempted to silence human rights defenders, civil society organizations, journalists, and critics through repressive laws, surveillance, attacks, and reprisals. It shut down the country's largest TV network. Maria Ressa, CEO of Rappler, which had reported on the killings, was convicted on a trumped-up cyber libel charge. The Congress fast-tracked an anti-terrorism bill which contains provisions that would effectively criminalize dissent. Its COVID-19 response mirrors its approach on the war on drugs, with the use of cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment and the repression of freedom of expression through a false information provision in the emergency decree. The domestic system has failed to provide accountability for the extrajudicial killings and other grave violations. The government has labeled as terrorists and encouraged violence against human rights defenders and activists calling for accountability. We echo the findings of the OHCHR and note that these violations continue to be committed by the state. We echo the call of 31 special procedure mandates for an on-the-ground international investigation. The government's actions have proven that it's unwilling and incapable of providing accountability. The Council must act on the recommendations of the High Commissioner and mandate an independent international investigation into human rights violations in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Human Rights Watch.
The High Commissioner's report on the Philippines provides a stark summary of the widespread and systematic rights violations ongoing in the country. Its findings on the murderous war on drugs, which has resulted in thousands of killings, are chilling, and there is much more, including extrajudicial killings of political activists, attacks on civic groups, assaults on media freedom and democratic space, and the government's failure to make any significant attempt to hold those responsible accountable. The report drives home the urgent need for the Council to take action for international accountability. About 100 children have died in the anti-drug campaign. Human Rights Watch recently reported on the broader impact of the drug war on children and their often impoverished families. We spoke to Jennifer, who tried to shield her unarmed father from the police who shot him dead in their house in 2016. The killing scarred Jennifer, then 12, leaving her unable to eat properly or stay in school. She still suffers nightmares of her father being gunned down with her helpless to protect him. There are too many Filipino children like Jennifer. President Duterte's drug war still rages, with killings reported daily. But rather than investigating crimes and bringing those responsible to justice, the administration harasses and jails critics and publicly encourages more killings. It has been 4 years this week since Duterte took office and unleashed this human rights catastrophe. UN member states should urgently take more robust action to address these serious violations. The Council has a responsibility to heed the recommendations by the High Commissioner and UN experts and create an independent, impartial investigation into the Philippines.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next speaker is Franciscans International.
Madam President, this is a joint statement of Franciscans International, Swiss Catholic Lenten Fund, Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, and Association of Major Religious Superiors in the Philippines. We welcome the High Commissioner report on the human rights situation in the Philippines and support its recommendations. Since the adoption of the Council's resolution last year, the human rights situation in the Philippines has not improved. The unlawful killings and vilification of dissent still continue. In addition, the response of the government during the COVID-19 pandemic has strengthened the existing structural poverty and inequalities in the country. We also would like to draw the Council's attention on the current process for the adoption of anti-terrorism bill that seeks to amend the Human Security Act of 2007. The bill has a broad and vague definition of terrorism and terrorists and other problematic provisions for human rights and the rule of law. In particular, The broad definition can be used to stifle dissent and curtail the rights to freedom of opinion and expression, to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association. Finally, we urge the Council to adopt the High Commissioner's recommendation on accountability by establishing a commission of inquiry due to the failure of the domestic accountability mechanisms to address the ongoing human rights violations in the Philippines. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Amnesty International.
Madam President, we thank the High Commissioner for her report, which paints a deeply concerning picture of continuing widespread and systematic extrajudicial executions fueled by a climate of near total impunity, despite increasing concern from the international community. This fits with our own conclusions, including that these ongoing killings amount to crimes against humanity. As the report makes clear, the near total impunity, as well as statements that amount to incitement to violence and discrimination from the very highest levels of government, continue to fuel the ongoing killings and other serious violations. We also share the High Commissioner's significant concerns over the increasing crackdown on civil society, the media, political opponents, and other government critics, including the continued arbitrary detention of Senator De Lima, the ongoing prosecution of journalist Maria Ressa, shutdown of ABS-CBN network, and the continued threats, arbitrary detention, and killings of human rights defenders and peaceful activists. Madam President, we regret the immediate response from the government that they cannot commit to the full implementation of the report's recommendations. At the same time, after the release of the report, the President repeated his call for people suspected of selling drugs to simply be killed. Having identified almost insurmountable barriers to justice and accountability at the national level, the UNHCR report concludes that independent, impartial, and effective investigations into the killings are critical and recommends that in the absence of clear and measurable outcomes from domestic mechanisms, the Council consider options for international accountability measures. We note that a group of special procedures also last week reiterated their call on the HRC to establish an independent, impartial investigation and urged Council to heed these calls. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Civicus.
Thank you, Madam President. Civicus and Karapitan welcome the strong report of the OHCHR. Yesterday, the Philippines was added to Civicus's watch list, reflecting its sharp decline in civic freedoms. President Duterte's government has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic by passing an emergency law used to curtail freedom of speech and silence the media. Journalists and social media users have already been targeted by it. Civicus member Karapitan is one of the many organizations threatened and smeared for their work, including for their reports to the UN. Reprisals are never acceptable, but even more egregious when perpetrated by a member of this council. The report shows that violations of human rights, including extrajudicial killings and arbitrary detention under Duterte's war on drugs, is pervasive. That vilification of dissent is becoming institutionalized and normalized in ways that will be very difficult to reverse. The new anti-terror bill will further erode the rule of law. Rampant impunity means that accountability for attacks against activists and journalists is virtually non-existent. Domestic mechanisms will not provide justice for the thousands killed at the hand of state authorities, for those unjustly imprisoned, for those silenced. We welcome the statements made during this interactive dialogue. We call on members of this Council to follow up with action and deliver a strong resolution which delivers the accountability measures that are so urgently needed and demonstrates that Council members are committed to upholding respect for and protection of human rights. No country is above scrutiny, nor should they be above accountability. We ask the High Commissioner what measures would she consider necessary for the Council to take in order to ensure justice for those affected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to the International Commission of Jurists.
Madam President, the ICJ concurs with the High Commissioner's finding that overemphasis by the government of the Philippines on national security and public order has led to serious human rights violations. Such violations will only increase if the draft Anti-Terrorism Act is approved and implemented. The draft law would, for example, allow detention without judicial warrant for up to 24 days. This is inconsistent with the prohibition of arbitrary detention under the ICCPR and the right of anyone arrested or detained on criminal grounds to be brought promptly before a judge. The Human Rights Committee has stressed that such judicial control of initial detention periods is not only essential to guarantee the right to liberty, but also to prevent torture, other ill treatment, and enforced disappearance. In line with both the High Commissioner's report and the 25th June 2020 statement by a large number of special procedures, the ICJ urges the government of the Philippines to accept the findings and recommendations and rapidly implement corrective measures in cooperation with UNHCR, civil society, and the Commission on Human Rights, and to abandon or fundamentally revise the draft anti-terror law. In the absence of clear, effective and measurable progress and accountability at the national level, this Council must stand ready to establish an independent international investigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to de Federatie van Nederlandse Verenigingen tot Integratie van Homoseksualiteit.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My name is Kakay Pamara and I serve at Union Theological Seminary, Philippines, and I'm also the co-chair of the South Africa-based organization, GENEVA. I welcome the report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the current situation in the Philippines and call on this council to take action against the increasing and grave human rights violations that are taking place in the Philippines in the name of the restoration of public order. Under the banner of combating terrorism and the COVID-19 response, the government is openly waging a war against the most vulnerable, including the LGBTQI people and human rights defenders. Last Friday, Bahaghari, an LGBT organization, held a pride protest in Manila asking for the implementation of free, systematic COVID testing, the passage of the anti-discrimination bill, and the veto of the anti-terror bill, which will legalize state-sanctioned violence. The police, in violation of health protocols, arrested 20 human rights defenders. They are now detained in the Manila Police District. No cases have been filed as they did not violate any laws. We call on the HRC to help put an end to the human rights violations. Tomorrow, the anti-terrorism bill risks coming into law, which is in contrast with international human rights standards. Let us not remain complacent. Let us not forget why we are all united under this roof today.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
President, FIDH welcomes the report released earlier this month by the High Commissioner on the serious and ongoing human rights violations in the Philippines. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the human rights situation in the country has further deteriorated. President Duterte's threat to issue shoot-to-kill instructions to deal with COVID-19 lockdown, quote-unquote, troublemakers, and to declare martial law-like virus crackdown are also troubling and reminiscent of Mr. Duterte's disastrous rhetoric in his so-called war on drugs. The assault on human rights defenders and government critics has intensified. The recent conviction of journalist Maria Ressa on politically motivated charges of cyber libel is illustrative of this trend. The proposed new anti-terror bill is also very likely to lead to more human rights violations and to further undermine the rule of law. Prison conditions remain another issue of concern. The country's jails remain among the world's most overcrowded, and many cases of COVID-19 infections have emerged among the prisoners. The government must heed the sensible and repeated calls for the release of certain prisoners to decongest jails as an urgent measure needed to prevent the spread of COVID-19. All these and other serious human rights violations continue to be committed amid pervasive impunity for the perpetrators. This is why we renew our calls for the establishment of an independent investigation into the human rights violations in the Philippines during the current Council session. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to the Swiss Catholic Lenten Fund.
Madam President, Swiss Catholic Lenten Fund, Franciscans International, Association of Major Religious Superiors in the Philippines, and the Task Force Details of the Philippines welcome the report on the Philippine human rights situation released by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The OHCHR has confirmed the systematic and widespread violations of human rights, especially the deprivation of the right to life that continued even amidst one of the most severe lockdowns imposed in any country. Even as I speak, Madam President, violations continue with arrests, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, and torture. Over a 3-month period, Task Force Details of the Philippines monitored 153 human rights violations, ranging from cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment to extrajudicial killings. Human rights defenders have relentlessly been subjected to attacks online and offline. Recently, 2 prominent human rights defenders have been red-tagged by the state, Sister Mary Jane Mananza of the Benedictine Order and Mr. Ritzley Santos III, Executive Director of Balaod, Mindanao. The Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates and Medical Action Group have also been tagged as part of the network of communist terrorists. These assaults on human rights and human rights defenders must come to an end. These killings must stop. We implore the Council to heed the recommendation of the OHCHR and establish a commission of inquiry. It will be a gigantic step forward in our common quest for accountability and justice. Thank you for this opportunity, Madam President.
Thank you very much. This was the last speaker we could accommodate for this dialogue. And so now we give the floor back to the speakers for their concluding remarks, starting with Mrs. Gomez-Tumpit.
Madam President. Thank you, Your Excellencies. The response of our government before the Council, the issues and concerns raised on the floor will help us calibrate how we can move forward and offer our assistance to improve the human rights situation on the ground. On the CHR being included in the review panel headed by the Department of Justice, we note that this development, and the CHR is ready to collaborate as we have always been. We urge that this measure be implemented within the technical cooperation framework offered by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In addition, for this review to be credible, crucial in the overall response of government is to accept that the killings are widespread and systematic. It must also not confine the coverage of this review to exclude other victims of the anti-drug campaign and must look beyond government's own numbers. It must demonstrate full transparency and cooperation with independent mechanisms, including the Commission on Human Rights. We will count on the commitment of the Justice Secretary that diligence will be exercised to ensure that the accounting of each and every killing and other human rights violations arising from this drug war. We cannot overemphasize the obligation of the state in upholding the right to life, the appreciation of both the negative and positive duties to protect, promote, and prevent the arbitrary deprivation of life by security forces and private parties. We will monitor the development arising from this interactive dialogue as we look forward to follow-on engagements at home. We will also continue to report on the progress of measures in forthcoming sessions of the Council, as well as in the dialogues with UN treaty bodies, including the forthcoming UN Human Rights Committee in its review of the Philippines' implementation of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The Commission stands firm as we are empowered by the solidarity that we have witnessed here today. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much indeed. The next speaker is Mr. Santiago.
Madam President, Excellencies, thank you very much again. Buti pa ang mga may kapangyarihan napapakinggan, said Rosa. In English, it's good if you have power, you are listened to. This is the usual cry of the disempowered whenever they find themselves at the receiving end when the law is supposed to protect them as well. All they cry for is the equal protection of the laws and due process of law, rights that are actually guaranteed by the Philippine Constitution. We are here right now not with the goal of pointing fingers. Rather, we are here to find solution to address institutional weaknesses mentioned before for the benefit of our people, part of the constructive efforts and dialogue. Although the Philippines indeed did not support the resolution leading to this report, it however still engaged the OHCHR, although not allowing a country visit. We have heard of the concerns of the Philippine government. We have heard as well the documented challenges to human rights, which are widespread and systematic. My only hope is that this Human Rights Council agree to concrete measures beyond this report to move towards transparency and accountability. With this, I reiterate my earlier recommendation for an independent and transparent fact-finding mission that will help the Philippine government address impunity and exact accountability. More than 3 years have already passed. Thousands have been killed. These have been documented, even coming from the Philippine government itself. And yet, accountability has remained elusive. The Philippine government has shown its resolve to address the ills of Philippine society. It is not too much to ask that it further commit with the same political will in erasing any doubt from the minds of human rights victims that there is indeed a systematic approach to such violations. There simply must be transparency and accountability. I join the High Commissioner for Human Rights in her call for the President of the Philippines to veto the anti-terrorism bill, more so that it can only exacerbate the already systematic violations that have been documented. I, together with many other civil society groups, look forward to working with the Philippine authorities to genuinely address human rights violations and exact accountability. Thank you once again, Excellencies, for your resolve to make international human rights mechanisms relevant to the lives of the people.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor back to His Excellency, Mr. Guevara. I'm sorry, but we can't hear you. Maybe you need to be unmuted. I'm sorry, we still can't hear you. Maybe Madam High Commissioner could start speaking and we can resolve the technical problem in the meantime.
I think we all believe that in a democracy we need people who can have the freedom of expression, who can defend human rights, and who can also, we have the freedom of press, among other freedoms. And one of the issues that we have been discussing here is the need to protect better human rights defenders, journalists, trade unionists, even lawyers who have been killed. And I think it's particularly dangerous when human rights defenders are slurred or labeled as terrorists or terrorist sympathizers or financiers. So I think the government needs to halt this kind of dangerous rhetoric. There is a need to ensure that the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly are respected and protected. Politically motivated charges that in human rights defenders are dropped and legal measures are taken to ensure their protection. So I take this opportunity to urge the government to ensure there are no reprisals against those persons and entities which have engaged with OHCHR for the present report. We also encourage the government to open and foster a dialogue with the civil society in order to build trust between the two sides. OHCHR stands ready to assist in working with the Commission of Human Rights to help bridge the gap between civil society and state authorities. And this must begin with a genuine attempt of accountability for the killings of human rights defenders and by halting, as I said before, the harmful rhetoric against human rights defenders. In the case against Maria Ressa Rappler and ABCBN, we are following both cases closely and with concern, given the deep unease among journalists about freedom of expression in the Philippines. In the case of Maria Ressa, this is a case that gives rise to many concerns: the use of the cybercrime law, the 12 years prescription period for a libel offense, and fears that the case against her and Rappler are politically motivated and retaliation for their critical coverage of the President and government action. So I hope her appeal will be considerable favorable. And I must also stress that under human rights standards, imprisonment is never an appropriate penalty for defamation. States should consider decriminalizing defamation. The other issue that I wanted to mention is that, of course, we're looking forward to continue in a collaborative way to technical cooperation with the government. We will be exploring that in further months ahead. We have identified already, as I mentioned in my words, some areas that could be useful, but of course this is something we need to explore with the government. In terms of the credibility of investigations, national and international. What I'm calling is for independent, impartial, effective, credible investigation. I have made a number, me and the Commissioner for the Human Rights Commission as well of the Philippines have made a lot of important recommendations, including empowering a truly independent body to conduct investigations, improving the collection and the publishing of data on extrajudicial killings, and ensuring closer cooperation of law enforcement bodies with the Commission of Human Rights of the Philippines. And of course, the Philippines could seek international support in this, including from my office. And we hope, we have heard the Secretary of Justice announcement, and we hope that this report can serve also as a kickstart to kickstart the process that will begin to unblock the many obstacles in the system for accountability for serious human rights violations in the Philippines. The process described by the Secretary of Justice is hopefully a step in the right direction. We look forward to learning more detail, assisting if we can, and most importantly, monitoring closely to see if there are real and concrete results. It would be also important for the government to involve all the national human rights institutions and Philippine civil society fully in that process. And I think it's also important for the Human Rights Council to continue to monitor the situation and look for clear and measurable outcomes. Before I finish, just one message on drugs. And the key message is that drugs require a public health approach. Drug users are people with a health problem. They are not criminals. And you need to include not only a law enforcement approach, but a public health approach. And those countries who have done it, have been much more successful in the fight against the drugs. Finally, our approach to this mandate has been a constructive one from the beginning, and we already thank the government, the Commission of Human Rights, and the Philippine civil society for the engagement throughout the process. And I hope that it has prompted some new steps forward on the part of the Philippines to address this issue through our recommendations. And I hope that it can open a new chapter of deeper cooperation and engagement between the Philippines OHCHR, and we'll be exploring this with the Justice Secretary and others in the coming week. I also would like to encourage the Philippines to re-engage and imbibe the special procedures, but I also call on the Human Rights Council to remain seized on developing the Philippines, to keep track of progress, and to continue to insist on accountability and an end to human rights violation. And my office is ready to cooperate, assist, and continue monitoring the situation. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. We might try now whether we can get the connection with the Minister of Justice. I don't know whether that will work. I can hear some noises. I hope we'll be able to hear the Minister.
Excellencies, we are very sorry for that technical glitch. We're trying to fix it in a few seconds.
We can hear you, Minister, now.
All right, okay. Excellencies, the government exhaustively addressed specific cases in the Philippine Human Rights Situationer, which is an official document of this meeting. We encourage concerned delegations to consult this document. Certain so-called emblematic cases have been cited and selectively used to make hasty conclusions about the situation of civic space, press freedom, and judicial independence. There are self-contradictions in these kinds of argument. While the international community upholds the independence of the judiciary and welcomes the court's decisions on many cases, such as the conviction of 53 public officials involved in the Maguindanao massacre, it regrettably entertains allegations of the court's partiality on processes and decisions in specific cases. Logic should be consistent on the principle of the equal application of law, and in making judgments about the independence of the judiciary and the outcomes of judicial processes. We support and encourage these courts grounded on facts and a diligent assessment of the merits of each case. We should take great care against concluding that certain situations are systemic or cases emblematic. There should be no moral ambiguity in looking at efforts to strengthen anti-terrorism legislation, as it is the state's duty to address, within the bounds of law, all threats and challenges to the security and safety of our communities. The Terrorism Index has consistently ranked the Philippines among countries most impacted by terrorism. In the Philippine situation, where the option of righting every possible wrong evidently and vigorously exists, there is no reasonable basis to allege impunity or lack of accountability for human rights violations. We are heartened by the wide acknowledgement we heard today of our good governance agenda and national accountability efforts, as well as encouragement for constructive ways forward. This manifests the desire of the majority to support effective human rights mechanisms and a council that bases its discussions and actions on facts and promotes genuine dialogue with concerned countries. We underscore our resolve to strengthen our national efforts to safeguard our vast and robust civil society and media space, strengthen the administration of justice, and address all claims and allegations case by case in a transparent and inclusive manner. At the same time, we highlight our commitment to continue to contribute collective efforts aimed at enhancing and upholding the integrity and objectivity of the Council and its processes and mechanisms to ensure that its work leads only to transformative and enduring impact on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Unfortunately, now did work. So this brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish to thank all the presenters and everybody for their participation. And if this is okay, we can start briefly with the next interactive dialogue. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the High Commissioner has kindly accepted to stay for the beginning of the next interactive dialogue, so we'll proceed on the oral update of the High Commission on the situation of human rights of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar, pursuant to Council Resolution S27/1. I just wanted to point out that we're opening the list of speakers. It will be closed in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to the High Commissioner.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, I now present the oral report on the Rohingya people of Myanmar requested by the Council in Resolution A/HRC/S27/1 of December 2017. Regrettably, I must once again report that the human rights situation for Rohingyas in Rakhine State has not improved and that conditions for their safe, dignified and sustainable return from Bangladesh are still not in place. During the Council's 43rd session, I presented a comprehensive report on the root causes of the violation and abuses suffered by the Rohingyas and other ethnic minorities in Myanmar. The report noted that discrimination and exclusion against these groups have been a hallmark of the laws and policies of Myanmar for over half a century. The ongoing armed conflict in Rakhine, which is affecting all communities, combined with the absence of a conducive environment for a voluntary, safe, dignified and sustainable return, have further exacerbated the Rohingyas' vulnerability. Restrictions on humanitarian access and freedom of movement linked to the COVID-19 pandemic have further exacerbated this situation. While I commend Myanmar for containing the virus to date, I appeal to the government to respect the Secretary General for a global ceasefire and the intensifying armed conflict in Rakhine State and address root causes that have prevented Rohingya return since 2017. Madam President, in Rakhine and Chin states, the civilian population, including several minority communities, continue to bear the brunt of an intensified armed conflict between the militaries known as the Tatmadaw and the Arakan Army. Just this weekend, the Tatmadaw launched a so-called clearance operation in the Kyauktan area of Ratekdaun Township in Rakhine. Residents were told to leave their home as, and I quote, anybody left behind would be considered Arakan Army. Estimates indicate as many as 10,000 residents have already fled as the Tatmadaw advance and heavy commenced. I call on the Tamadaw to extend the ceasefire already in place elsewhere in the country to Rakhine and Chin State and to cease immediately these clearance operations. My office has been documenting a pattern of serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, including airstrikes, shelling of civilian areas, and the destruction and burning of villages in other areas. Last month, the Tamadaw reportedly burned large areas of Butchidang Township where Rohingyas lived there before 2017. According to eyewitnesses and satellite images, areas where up to a dozen Rohingya villages once stood lay in ashes. These villages were not only the homes Rohingya refugees hoped to return to, they also constituted evidence of what happened in 2017. Only 5 months ago, the International Court of Justice issued an order to prevent the destruction of evidence of allegations of genocide. It is imperative that Myanmar take immediate and urgent measures to cease reckless military operations and to preserve what remains in those areas. Excellencies, the Rohingya refugee crisis has effectively become protracted with no solution in sight. Myanmar's government should take immediate steps to address this chronic situation, including the amending of the 1982 citizenship law and restoring Rohingya citizenship. Myanmar continues to impose national verification cards on the Rohingya, a document which denies their citizenship, leaving them stateless and restricting their access to basic services or free movement. This situation should be resolved prior to this year's general elections so that the Rohingyas' right to stand for public office and to vote can be restored. Recently, the government released hundreds of Rohingya people who had been imprisoned for traveling outside Rakhine. I hope this measure is a step towards restoring the freedom of movement and that more action by the governments to address root causes of discrimination against the Rohingya will be forthcoming. The COVID-19 pandemic further aggravates the suffering of Rohingya refugees. Reports of dozens of cases in refugee camps in Bangladesh expose the vulnerability of hundreds of thousands of people living in such cramped conditions. I'm also seriously concerned about the fate of Rohingya people currently on vessels stranded at sea. I call on all relevant member states and regional mechanisms to take action to protect these people's lives. Regarding investigations and accountability, I note that Myanmar's National Commission of Inquiry has delivered its report on the 2017 violence to the government, but its full text is still not public. This Commission's independence and the credibility of its investigation has long been in doubt. I urge the government to publish the report and to cooperate with international accountability mechanisms. In this context, I know that Myanmar's president has issued a number of decrees following the International Court of Justice provisional measures. It is time now to fully translate these decrees into concrete actions. The fighting in Rakhine must end. Civilians must be protected. Evidence of serious violations must be preserved. Madam President, Resolution A/HRC/S27/1 sought a comprehensive solution to the Rohingya crisis within 3 years. 2.5 years later, conditions in Rakhine remain bleak. It is time for that situation to change. The international community, including my office, stands ready to support real efforts to resolve the crisis, ensure sustainable peace and development for all communities, and allow Myanmar's Rohingya to return home in safety and dignity. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. And now, as is the practice, I will give the floor to the country concerned. The distinguished representative of Myanmar has the floor.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, the government of Myanmar is working persistently and resolutely towards a democratic federal union despite multiple challenges it faces. The Rakhine issue is only one of the many challenges that Myanmar is facing. Rakhine State is faced with parallel security threats posed by the terrorist attacks of ASA and AA. Amid these growing security threats and numerous challenges, the government is relentlessly striving to achieve its goal of bringing sustainable peace, stability, harmony, and development in Rakhine State. We are taking different measures in various fields. In this regard, allow me to inform the Council of some salient points we have taken among others. Firstly, the government of Myanmar pays special emphasis to the development in Rakhine State. MSDP, developed in line with the SDGs, include actions for the implementation of the recommendation of the Advisory Commission of Rakhine State. Special economic zones are being implemented in the state for the socio-economic development. Rakhine State Investment Fair was held in 2019. Several vocational trainings have been organized to create employment opportunities. Secondly, we are making utmost efforts for social cohesion and living harmoniously among different communities. Government of Myanmar, in collaboration with the local NGO, have organized over 200 awareness-raising and capacity-building trainings throughout Rakhine State. Friendly bazaars are also open in a number of townships in Rakhine with an aim to bringing reconciliation. Over 35 youth camps were organized to build understanding, respect, and trust among young people of all communities living in Rakhine State. Thirdly, the government is delivering humanitarian assistance to the people in need in Rakhine. The government has geared up its efforts to enhance the provision of humanitarian aid in coordination with the United Nations and international organizations such as WFP and ICRC. Fourth, we have been working in good faith for the early repatriation in line with the criteria mentioned in the bilateral agreement. There are many obstacles hindering the commencement of the repatriation, but we continue to engage with Bangladesh to implement the agreement for repatriation even in the time of global pandemic. Despite lack of progress in repatriation, hundreds of displaced persons returned to Rakhine State on their own volition through an official route. Myanmar is working on a pilot project to commence small-scale repatriation. We have also requested UNDP and UNHCR to provide assistance for construction of houses and necessary infrastructure in the two villages. The MOU between Myanmar and UNDP and UNHCR was signed in 2018 to assist the government in its effort to implement the bilateral repatriation process with Bangladesh. The two UN agencies have already conducted fee assessment and implemented 75 quick impact projects to improve community infrastructure and to assess the needs of the people. In addition, we are also working with the ASEAN team. Fifth, Myanmar is willing and able to address the issue of accountability. The domestic justice system of the country must be respected. The criminal investigation and prosecution body was formed based on the report submitted by the ICOE in January 2020. Moreover, Tamro is conducting its code of inquiry. Sixth, in November 2019, the government adopted the National Strategic Plan for Resettlement of IDPs and Closures of IDP Camps. The strategy also includes the plan to close IDP camps in Rakhine State. Finally, the internet services in Sam Township in Rakhine State and Palawa Township of Chin State were suspended to prevent the exploitation of the services by the AA, to incite hatred among different ethnic groups, and to deter their terrorist acts such as the detonation of IEDs and remote landmines. But mobile phone and SMS services are still intact. Madam President, Myanmar's challenges are further exacerbated by the unexpected COVID-19. As the world faces the challenge of COVID-19 pandemic, Myanmar has begun the preventive measures in the early stage of the outbreak since January 2020. The measures were based on the principle of leaving no one behind, which cover all vulnerable communities. To effectively address the potential COVID-19 outbreak at IDP camps in Rakhine State, the government is working with the ICRC for prevention, control, and treatment of COVID-19 in old and new IDP camps. Madam President, in conclusion, I wish to reiterate that not only the Rakhine issue, but the various issues throughout the country is complex. However, we are resolute to overcome these long and complex challenges with our concerted and relentless efforts. We again ask the international community, instead of imposing impediments, to extend helping hands in a constructive and sincere manner to Myanmar in our efforts for finding a sustainable solution towards a peaceful and prosperous country. Full version of the statement will be available on the extranet. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And this brings us to the end of this morning session. We will reconvene at 3 o'clock, and then the real interactive dialogue will start. I hereby close the first meeting of the 44th session of the Human Rights Council. I thank you all very much.
who's bite me with them false advices. Bootleg my CD, talking about you working, talking like you ballin', talking about you got it, patting on my pocket. Bitch, know I know you from Frozen and Black Soul Operas. My mob is slim as my goddess. You can't reach the top of everybody. I got things in order. Who important? You ain't Uncle Bobby or my cousin Richard. Please don't lean on me, bitch. I'm vibing. Please don't pretend. Can't depend on me, but bitch, I got it. I'm on fire. You so shake on like, you switch like on like, for all that gon' right, I'm gon' that won't right.